Section 21 of A History of the Papacy, from the Great Schism to the Sack of Rome, Volume 5, by Mandell Creighton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Book 5, Chapter 17, Rome under Julius II, Part 2. Amid the tumult of political endeavour, Julius II little thought that his name would be borne through the ages chiefly by three workmen whom he employed, Bramante, Michelangelo, and Raffaele. Yet it is mostly owing to their labours that the fiery personality which dominated his own contemporaries has never ceased to enthrall men's minds. Its great aspirations were expressed in stone by Bramante. Its passionate force breathes through the frescoes of Michelangelo. Its triumphant energy is set forth by the pencil of Raffaele. Julius II had the true mark of greatness, that he sympathized with all that was great. He was more than a mere patron of art. He provided great artists with great opportunities. He did not merely employ great artists. He impressed them with a sense of his own greatness, and called out all that was strongest and noblest in their own nature. They knew that they served a master who was in sympathy with themselves. Julius II was a stern master, fitful and capricious. Even Michelangelo found that it was useless to rebel against his will. When he had finished his unlucky statue of Julius II at Bologna, he was ordered to return to Rome and continue his work at the Pope's tomb. When he arrived, he found that Julius II had changed his mind. He thought that it was unlucky to have his tomb erected in his lifetime. Michelangelo was bidden to lay aside his sculptor's chisel and betake himself to the art of the painter. The Pope had resolved to carry out the adornment of the Sistine Chapel, whose walls were enriched by the panels of the great artists of the previous generation. Julius II wished that the space above the windows, whence sprang the flat vaulted ceiling, should be adorned by the painter's skill. The task was not to Michelangelo's taste, and he found it hard to produce a satisfactory design. He had difficulties in contriving a scaffold and in procuring colours. The work of his assistants did not please him, and he had sadly to dismiss them, destroy their painting, and carry on his labour single-handed. He made mistakes at first in his process of fresco painting, and his works were destroyed by damp. For months he was in despair. He lived in poverty, and dared not ask the Pope for money, for he had nothing to show. "I cannot get on with the work and have no claim for pay," he wrote to his father. "I am wasting my time in vain, God help me." Never was a work of art so entirely the result of the travail and agony of the artist's soul. Michelangelo began his work on May 10th, 1508. As he laboured on, sick at heart, the restless Pope often clambered up the ladder that led to the giddy platform where the painter lay. Had it not been for his persistency, the painter's spirit would have flagged. "When will you have done?" asked the Pope. "When I can," said Michelangelo. "You seem to wish," said Julius in a rage, "that I should have you thrown down from your scaffold." At last, on November 1st, 1509, half the work was done, and Julius II ordered the scaffolding to be removed that men might see and criticize. They came and gazed with wonder and delight. None doubted that they stood before a masterpiece. The ceiling had been by the painter's art gifted with new architectural forms. Its plain, flat vault had been laid out with cornice, arches, and niches. The whole surface was a magnificent delusion, in which architecture, sculpture, and painting seemed to combine. Gigantic figures of prophets and sibyls rose between the windows from the wall. Caryatids bore the cornice. Huge slaves with garlands were seated by the arches at its edge. In the center of the ceiling, the painted panels told the story of the creation of the world and of man, told what man was when God was by his side, and what man became when he lost the light of the divine presence. Never since the days of Phidias had the human form been raised to such dignity. Never did Italian art achieve a greater technical triumph. Never has the painter's brush carried so profound a message to the minds and consciences of men. Julius II was satisfied with Michelangelo's work and urged him to finish it. The scaffolding had been removed before the last touches had been given to the painting. Julius II would have it again erected, that the figures might be enriched with gilding. Michelangelo pleaded that this was needless. "But it looks so poor," said the Pope. "Holy Father," answered the painter, "they were but poor folk whom I have painted there. They wore no gold upon their garments." Julius II smiled and submitted. Michelangelo was allowed to go on with the other half of the ceiling. In vain he asked for leave to go to Florence and visit his family. Julius II was inexorable, and Michael was chained to his work till it was finished. When Julius II was on his deathbed, he left instructions to his executors that Michelangelo should continue his work at the monument, and a contract was made for a design on a somewhat smaller scale. The tomb was no longer to stand foursquare, but was to be placed against the wall and have fewer figures. For 3 years Michelangelo laboured. Then he was sent by Leo X to other work at Florence, and the tomb of Julius II was put aside during his absence. Its design was again and again contracted from the mighty scale on which it had first been planned. Finally, in 1550, it was erected as we see it still, not beneath the dome of St. Peter's, but in the little church of San Pietro in Vincoli, from which Julius II took his cardinal title. The unquiet spirit of Julius II haunted Michelangelo, and the execution of the tomb was a cause of constant trouble to the sculptor. Through the weariness of all concerned, it assumed its present shape and was placed in its present position, for which its proportions are much too vast. Huge pilasters of marble stand against the wall, and on the upper story rests the sarcophagus of Julius II and his recumbent figure. In a niche above the Pope stands the Madonna with the Holy Child. In the side niches are a prophet and a Sibyl. These are the work of Michelangelo's pupils, Maso del Bosco and Raffaele di Montelupo. In the lower story are 3 statues by Michelangelo's own hand. He had made others which were rendered useless by the change in the position of the tomb, and 2 of his noblest works, 2 captive slaves originally designed for this work, are now in the Louvre. Still, with all its losses and all its evil fortune, the tomb of Julius II is the mightiest of sculptured memorials to the dead. The 3 figures by Michelangelo are masterpieces of Italian sculpture. A colossal figure of Moses is seated in the middle of the lower story of the monument. On either side of him stand Leigh and Rachel, Dante's types of the practical and the contemplative life. Moses is not set before us as the lawgiver, but as the great leader of his people. Holding the table of the law in one hand, with the other he clutches his beard and looks out with a resolute force upon a craven folk. So Michelangelo idealized the fiery personality of Julius II. The mighty frame of Moses, which seems to be with difficulty held in rest, sets forth the stormy spirit of the Pope, who strove to mould states and kingdoms to his will, and owned no bounds to his furious impetuosity. Besides Michelangelo, Julius II summoned to Rome the other great artist of his day, Raffaele Santi. The son of a vigorous Umbrian painter, Raffaele, after his father's death, studied under Perugino, and had gained some fame when in 1508 he came to Rome at the age of 25. Julius II at once set him to work to decorate the chambers in the Vatican in which he chose to live. After abandoning the rooms which Alexander VI had occupied, he selected for his own dwelling the rooms which Nicholas V had built. These rooms were covered by frescoes from the hands of Piero della Francesca, Luca Signorelli, Perugino, and Sodoma. At first, Julius II intended that Raffaelli should thoroughly finish the work that they had begun, and he first undertook the second of the 4 rooms, the Stanza della Segnatura, where the Pope used to receive the documents which required his signature. The first of Raffaelli's paintings was a female figure representing theology, which occupied an unfinished panel in the ceiling. Julius II was so delighted with this work that he ordered the existing paintings to be destroyed, that Raffaele might have free scope for the harmonious decoration of the entire room. Raffaele allowed much of the merely decorative work, with its mythological medallions, to remain on the ceiling, but the wall paintings were swept away. It seems most probable that Julius II suggested, he certainly approved, the noble series of designs which Raffaele executed. The room represents the whole field of human knowledge, sacred and profane. In the 4 divisions of the ceiling are allegorical figures of theology, poetry, philosophy, and law. Round them are grouped appropriate medallions. The 4 walls unfold the muster roll of the heroes of literature and science. Theology shows us the heavens opened. The Father blesses his church on earth. The Son, seated amidst his apostles, with outstretched hands, pleads gently with mankind. The Holy Spirit is descending from heaven to shed divine grace on the sacrament, which stands upon the altar beneath. Round the altar are grouped the fathers and great teachers of the Church, amongst them Dante and Savonarola, and in the foreground are figures which tell of the living power of Christian faith and Christian teaching in the painter's day. No less splendid in conception are the pictures which represent the triumphs of poetry and philosophy. Apollo, crowned with laurels, is seated on the hill of Parnassus with the Muses by his side, while the hill slope is filled with the great singers of all time from Homer to Sannazaro. In the school of Athens, a stately hall, modelled on Bramante's design of St. Peter's, are gathered the great teachers of antiquity, whose writings seem to the men of the Renaissance a fount of inexhaustible wisdom. The space allotted for the 4th picture, which represented law, was divided into 2 by a window. Raffaele has shown 2 groups, Justinian promulgating the Digest, and Gregory IX promulgating the Decretals. If Michelangelo's work in Rome testifies to the terrific side of the character of Julius II, the work of Raffaele testifies to the greatness of his mind. The decoration of a room was a small matter, but Julius II had his room converted into a mighty memorial of the dignity of man's achievements. He had displayed before his eyes all that was best and noblest in the past. In the largest spirit of human sympathy, he took possession of the entire heritage of human knowledge. We need not speak of the grace, the beauty, the dignity of Raffaele's work, or the consummate skill shown in the composition of these large frescoes. Julius II was so delighted with the result that he ordered Raffaele to proceed with the other 3 rooms as well. Raffaele had assigned him as the motive for his treatment of the next room, God protecting his church. His first picture was the expulsion of Heliodorus from the temple of Jerusalem, as told in the 2nd book of Maccabees. Here dramatic movement takes the place of stately repose. Heavenly messengers sweep through the temple, and the overthrown tyrant crouches before them. In the background, the high priest and his attendants are deep in prayer. We cannot doubt the influence of Julius II on this picture, for in the corner is a portrait of the Pope, borne in his litter, and gazing calmly down on the prostrate king. The picture was an unmistakable allegory of his success in expelling the French from Italy. A second picture in the same room was nearly finished when Julius II died. It represented the testimony of God against unbelief by the miracle of Bolsena, when a priest who doubted the sacrament of the altar saw blood trickle from the consecrated host. Besides his paintings in the Vatican, Raffaele found time to work for other patrons. For his friend Sigismondo de' Conti, one of the papal secretaries, he painted a Madonna as a votive offering to a church. This picture long rested at Sigismondo's native town of Foligno, and bears the name of the Madonna of Foligno. The portrait of the kneeling donor shows us the clear-cut features of the chief man of letters who served Julius II. Sigismondo came to Rome under Sixtus IV in 1476, and had a long experience of papal service. Julius II made him his private secretary, and employed him in many delicate negotiations. Sigismondo employed his leisure in writing a history of his own times, which is an excellent summary of the events. But his official reserve and his striving after classical dignity of style have prevented him from expressing his own judgments. The facts which he relates are known from other sources. We wish that one who saw so much close at hand had given us more personal details and more of his own opinions. Sigismondo strove to be a classical historian, but he has no conception of historical progress, and no criticism of the general tendency of his time. He misses the charm of a diarist or memoir writer. He does not attain to the rank of an historian. Julius II was too much engaged in practical pursuits to pay much attention to literature. Occasionally he was pleased with a complimentary harangue, and recompensed the orator with a present, but he attracted no literary men to Rome. Once, indeed, he was led into the unwonted act of crowning a poet, more as an act of political complaisance than from any serious intention. It would seem that the Vatican librarian Tommaso Inghirami persuaded him to provide a literary entertainment for the Bishop of Gurk when he came as imperial ambassador in November 1512. He consulted Paris de Gracie, who answered that there was no precedent for the coronation of a poet by the Pope. He added further that poets wrote about Jupiter and Pegasus and such like heathenish things, which it was indecorous for a pope to recognize. Julius II seemed convinced, but a few days afterwards, at a dinner in the Belvedere given to the Bishop of Gurk, a young Roman, Vincenzo Pimpinello, attired as Orpheus, recited some verses in honor of the Pope's victory over the French. He was followed by Francesco Grappaldi, secretary to the embassy of Parma, who similarly sang the glories of Italy, freed from the barbarian yoke. Then Inghirami brought 2 laurel wreaths which the Pope and the Bishop of Gurk held between them, while the Pope said, "We, by our apostolic authority, and the Bishop of Gurk, by the authority of the Emperor, make you poet, ordering you to write of the exploits of the Church." Neither Pimpinello nor Grappaldi were of any merit as poets. Julius II was not fortunate in his solitary attempt at literary patronage. The most precious memorial of Julius II is his portrait by Raffaele, which is a veritable revelation of his character. Seated in an armchair, with head bent downwards, the Pope is in deep thought. His furrowed brow and his deep-sunk eyes tell of energy and decision. The down-drawn corners of his mouth betoken constant dealings with the world. Raffaele has caught the momentary repose of a restless and passionate spirit, and has shown all the grace and beauty which are to be found in the sense of force repressed and power at rest. He sets before us Julius II as a man resting from his labours, and brings out all the dignity of his rude, rugged features. The Pope is in repose, but repose to him was not idleness, it was deep meditation. A man who has done much and suffered much, he finds comfort in his retrospect and prepares for future conflicts. End of section 21. Section 22 of A History of the Papacy, from the Great Schism to the Sack of Rome, Volume 5, by Mandell Creighton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Book 5, Chapter 18, Beginnings of Leo X, 1513 to 1515, Part 1. The death of Julius II plunged Rome into genuine grief, before which the voice of turbulence and faction was silent. Never in the memory of man had the city remained so quiet on the death of the Pope. There was nothing to disturb the action of the cardinals, or prevent them from carrying out the funeral rites of Julius II and the preparations for the conclave. They scarcely showed themselves deserving of this exceptional consideration. Their behaviour was not dignified, for their first care was to lay hands on the treasure which Julius II had left behind. In spite of his military expenditure, Julius II had practised strict economy, and the papal treasury contained upwards of 200,000 ducats, besides 2 tiaras with the triple crown, 2 simple tiaras, and jewels to the value of 50,000 ducats. The poor cardinals thought sadly of the bull which prohibited simony in the new election, and wished to use the opportunity which was in their power. They hunted out the constitution of Paul II, which provided that every cardinal whose revenues were below 4,000 ducats should receive from the Pope 200 ducats monthly till he reached that amount. And as Julius II had not made this payment, they proposed to pay themselves the arrears which were due. This plan was frustrated by the firmness of the captain of the castle of Sant'Angelo, who refused to give up to the cardinals the keys of the treasury. He showed them a brief of Julius II, forbidding him to deliver them save to the future Pope. The cardinals declared him a rebel against the Sacred College, but the castellan was not to be moved, and they went away baffled. When all was ready, the 25 cardinals who were in Rome entered the conclave on the evening of March 4th, 1513. They first attended Mass in a chapel of St. Peter's, where each man, as he gazed upon the vast columns that rose amid the heaps of stones, was reminded of the great task which awaited the future Pope. The wind howled through the chapel, and the altar lights could scarcely be protected from its violence. The great church of Rome was a dreary and piteous ruin. The result of the election was very doubtful, and popular opinion pointed to Raffaele Royario, Flisco, and the Hungarian cardinal, Archbishop of Strigo, as the most likely men. The cardinals did not hasten to proceed to any decisive step. They drew up regulations for the future Pope and signed them with great ceremony, till the guardians of the conclave grew impatient, and on the evening of March 7th reduced the food of the cardinals to 1 dish at each meal. On March 9th they took more stringent measures and allowed them nothing but a vegetable diet. The cardinals in reality felt a difficulty how to proceed. There was no one specially marked out for the office, and the obvious course would have been to choose the most respectable of the senior members of the college. This is what the older cardinals wished to do, and if this view had prevailed, there would have been a basis for discussion. But the younger members of the college wished for a new departure in the papacy. They were weary of the excitement which the pontificates of Alexander VI and Julius II had so plentifully supplied. They wanted a kindly, genial, magnificent pope, a man of high character and some repute, who would do credit to the office without the intolerable activity in political matters which had so long prevailed. They were not satisfied with any of the older cardinals. Some were too old, others too feeble, others not sufficiently respectable in life and character. In this divided state of opinion, each party was bound to put forward some candidate. The seniors named Raffaele Riario. The juniors named Giovanni de' Medici. An attempt was made at a compromise, but there was no one on whom both parties could agree. It became a question of endurance, and nothing was to be gained by going through the form of holding a scrutiny. In such a struggle, the juniors had physical strength on their side and showed greater resolution. The league of the seniors gradually began to waver. Cardinal Medici was especially helped by the support of Cardinal Soderini, who was clever enough to see which was the winning side. He thought it best to make terms, and his example of trusting to the generosity of his hereditary foe made a great impression on the others. Perhaps also the elder cardinals were induced to give way because Cardinal Medici was known to suffer from an incurable ulcer, and needed a surgeon's care even in the conclave. Young though he was, he did not promise to be long-lived. At last it was found necessary to take some definitive step. On March 10th, the bull of Julius II against simony was read, and the first scrutiny was held. It declared nothing, as the votes were scattered. Cardinal Serra, whom no one seriously thought of, received most votes. After this, Cardinals Riario and Medici had a private conference, the result of which was that the election of Cardinal Medici was practically decided. The cardinals went to him and greeted him as pope. Many of them escorted him to his cell and asked him what name he had chosen. Next day a formal scrutiny was held, and Cardinal Medici was duly elected. The announcement caused universal surprise. No one had thought of him as a possible candidate, but everyone was delighted as well as surprised. There was nothing known against the new pope except his youth and his exceeding good nature. Giovanni de' Medici had been made cardinal when he was a boy, and became pope when he was still a young man. He was only in his 38th year, and had nothing to recommend him except the political importance which he had gained by the restoration of his family to Florence. He had shown great tact in the years that followed the exile of the Medici, and had done his utmost to be at peace with all men. Under the pontificate of Alexander VI, he had found it wise to absent himself for a few years, during which he travelled in Germany and France, till Alexander VI ceased to suspect him, and he returned to Rome. Julius II had no especial love for him, but when the restoration of the Medici became part of his political plans, he made Giovanni his legate in Bologna, and so raised him to a political personage. Giovanni showed considerable cleverness in managing the Florentine Revolution. Everyone felt that he was the real head of the Medici, and rather than his elder brother Giuliano, directed the measures of their party. He guided the steps by which the Florentine government was put into the hands of trusty men, and he knew how to throw a cloak of moderation over violent measures. Still, the Florentine Republic did not pass away without a struggle against its destroyers. A conspiracy against the Medici was set on foot, but it was revealed by the incredible carelessness of a hot-headed youth, Pietro Paolo Boscoli, who let fall from his pocket a compromising document in the midst of the crowd that kept the carnival. In consequence of real or pretended evidence, many of the chief Florentines were exiled, among them Niccolò Machiavelli. Boscoli was executed, and the account of his mental struggles to die as a Christian is one of the most striking illustrations of the religious feelings of the men of the Renaissance. To them, the example of classical antiquity was in the foreground, while the teaching of the gospel was the abiding background of their moral being. In the time of action, they turned to the memories of Rome for their examples. Reflection brought before them the precepts of Christ. "Drive Brutus from my head," exclaimed Boscoli, "that I may take the last step wholly as a Christian." And the great question for the friends of the would-be penitent was the opinion of Thomas Aquinas on the sinfulness of tyrannicide. The good confessor who heard the account of his simple-hearted, if mistaken, patriotism could say afterwards, "I wept 8 days almost without ceasing. Such feelings of affection did that night inspire. I believe that his soul is in peace and has not undergone purgatory." Boscoli and another conspirator were executed as Cardinal Giovanni was on his way to Rome for the papal election. The conspiracy awakened no feeling of bitterness or thirst for revenge in the cardinal's mind. Already he was a statesman of a practical order, who saw that he could not get his own way without creating some opposition, and resolved that he would try by geniality and kindliness to make that opposition as little formidable as might be. He had some of the cultivated cynicism of his father. He wished to enjoy himself in his own way, and he wished everyone else to share his enjoyment. It was their own fault if they were impracticable and refused to accept the offer. He pitied rather than hated those who were their own foes more than his. His only desire was that Florence should see what was her own advantage, and he judged it unreasonable of those who did not see that their advantage really agreed with his. All men rejoiced at the accession of Giovanni de' Medici, and when he took the name of Leo X, they smiled and said that he was more like a gentle lamb than a fierce lion. The cardinals could not restrain their satisfaction at escaping from the stern rule of Julius II. "They all behaved," says an observer, "as if they had themselves become popes." The story was widely believed that one of the first sayings of the new pope to his brother Giuliano was, "Let us enjoy the papacy, since God has given it to us." It seemed in men's eyes a worthy motto, and the cardinals presented so many requests to the new pope that he said with a smile, "Take my crown and grant what you wish, as if you were pope yourselves." The festivities of Leo X's coronation showed that a reign of magnificence and peace was to begin. Men saw the Duke of Ferrara, who had been so long pursued by Julius II with relentless animosity, welcomed in Rome and invested once more with his ducal dignity. He even acted as the squire of the Pope, and helped him to mount the steed on which he rode through the streets. The pomp and splendour of the procession was famous even in those days of pageants. The Pope's train was numerous, and the mixture of ecclesiastical, military, and civil dresses made a dazzling display of colours. Rome was unsparing of decorations. The streets were all ablaze with rich devices, triumphal arches, and allegorical figures of every sort, while the invention of the artist and the poet was alike strained to produce designs and mottos. The rich banker Agostino Chigi showed his ingenuity by a brief summary of the past history of the papacy and a forecast of its future. A mighty arch bore a living nymph attended by Moorish pages. On the frieze ran an inscription, "Once Venus reigned, then Mars, now comes the reign of Pallas." A witty goldsmith who lived near showed greater knowledge of the times. He set up a statue of Venus that bore the legend, "Mars reigned, Pallas reigns, I, Venus, will always reign." Mythology and religion, history, sacred and profane, were alike laid under contribution to supply motives for singing the praises of the new pope. There was indeed no end to his greatness. However much Leo X might be desirous of a life of peace, he soon had to face political questions of a disturbing kind. The treaty between Louis XII. And the Venetians was the prelude to a new invasion of Milan by the French. Louis XII. Sent to Giuliano de' Medici that he might sound the intentions of the new pope. But Leo X. knew that the possession of Parma and Piacenza would only be allowed by Massimiliano Sforza, and that a French restoration would mean their loss to the Papacy. So he rejected the overtures of Louis XII. And renewed the league which Julius II. Had made with Maximilian. A greater plan, however, of political action was soon brought before the Pope. Henry VIII. Of England was so ill satisfied with his first ventures into foreign politics that he wished to compass some large design. He proposed to bring about a European confederacy against France, and divide her territories amongst the confederates. France was to be attacked on all sides at once. Ferdinand would invade Béarn. Henry VIII. Would enter Normandy. Maximilian would overrun the Burgundian provinces. It would be well if the Pope also undertook to pour his forces into Provence. The example of the League of Cambrai was to be followed on a large scale, and Europe was to be pacified by the destruction of the one power who was a constant menace to her neighbours. So dreamed Henry VIII., inspired no doubt by the magnificent genius of Wolsey, who wished to set England in the foremost place in the politics of Europe. It seemed an easy matter to revive the old claims of the English kings to the throne of France, and to summon others to take their share of the booty. But Ferdinand of Spain shook his head over the plan, and did not give it a very favourable ear. There was not much that he could hope to gain from the partition of France, which he saw would chiefly fall to the advantage of the House of Austria. So he listened to Henry VIII.'s plan, and meanwhile made a truce for a year with Louis XII. Soon afterwards he entered into Henry VIII.'s league as well. The crafty old man resolved to be on good terms with both parties, to do nothing himself, but be ready to take advantage if anything important happened. Maximilian was more bent on attacking the Venetians than on a war against France. He pleaded that he could not make an expedition without money, and Henry VIII. Undertook to pay him 125,000 crowns. The combination against France was not very strong when, on April 5th, the league between Henry VIII., Maximilian, and Ferdinand was signed at Mechlin. It was still called the Holy League, but the recovery or defence of the states of the Church no longer appears among its objects. It was solely directed to the partition of the territory of France, and the Pope was requested to cause all the annoyance that he could against the French king, to make no truce with him so long as the war lasted, to give temporal aid, and to fulminate ecclesiastical censures against all who opposed the League. This was a good deal to demand from the Pope, and Leo X. was not a man of far-reaching schemes. He was contented with things as they were, and only wished that the invasion of the Milanese, which the French king was projecting, might be repulsed. Louis XII., for his part, trusted to his alliance with Venice and his truce with Ferdinand, and resolved to conquer Milan before the English army was ready to take the field. The restoration of the French power in Italy would be a sure means of breaking up the league which had been formed against him, and would leave Henry VIII. Without allies in his invasion of France. Accordingly, at the beginning of May, a large army under La Trémouille and Gian Giacomo Trivolzio crossed the Alps, and the Swiss troops of Massimiliano Sforza were not strong enough to oppose them. The people had no liking for their new duke, who had been brought up in a foreign land, whose feeble character they had learned, and whose extravagance burdened them with heavy taxes. The exiles returned. The towns surrendered to the French or the Venetians. Novara and Como alone remained faithful to their duke, whose only hope was in the Swiss. The Swiss, however, had solid reasons for keeping him in Milan. He paid them an annual tribute, and they were willing to fight so long as they were paid. Leo X would not send any troops to the defence of Milan, but he sent 42,000 ducats. A body of 7,000 Swiss infantry crossed the mountains and entered Novara, expecting reinforcements. The French, who were provided with artillery, besieged Novara, which could not long hold out. But news that more Swiss troops were on the way induced the French army to retire to a little distance. The garrison of Novara resolved to risk a battle, and on June 6th silently advanced against the French camp and fell on them unawares. They had no horse and no artillery, yet they attacked an army 3 times as numerous as themselves and well provided with guns and cavalry. For a time the battle raged fiercely, but the Swiss kept their ranks and fought their way to the enemy's guns, which they seized and turned against them. The rout of the French was complete. They fled in panic, and scarcely stayed till they had crossed the Alps. All Italy was astounded at this exploit of the Swiss, which seemed to outdo the famous deeds of old. End of section 22. Section 23 of A History of the Papacy, from the Great Schism to the Sack of Rome, Volume 5, by Mandell Creighton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Book 5, Chapter 18, Beginnings of Leo X, 1513 to 1515, Part 2. The defeat of the French in Italy was rapidly followed by Henry VIII's invasion of France. On June 30th, 1513, he landed at Calais, and on August 1st advanced to the siege of Terouanne. There he was joined by Maximilian, in whose interest, rather than in that of England, the expedition was conducted. For its object was to secure the Netherlands against France by the capture of the chief fortress on the frontier. The French resistance was feeble and half-hearted. Their best troops had been scattered at Novara, and those who took the field were demoralized. The army which came to the relief of Terouanne fled, almost without striking a blow, and the French themselves made merry over their defeat by calling it the Battle of Spurs. Terouanne surrendered and was given over to Maximilian, who razed its defences to the ground. The Scottish king vainly attempted to help his ally of France. He raised a gallant army and invaded England, only to fall in the fatal battle of Flodden Field. Henry VIII pursued his campaign, undisturbed by the threats of Scotland. The strong town of Tournai was taken on September 24th, and Maximilian was anxious to pursue a campaign in which he gained all the profit. But the season was late, and Henry VIII thought that enough had been done for the protection of the Low Countries, while Scottish affairs needed his presence at home. He made arrangements to renew the war in the spring. Ferdinand of Spain bound himself by a treaty signed at Lille on October 17th to invade Guienne, while Henry VIII entered Normandy. Another invasion of the French territory had been at the same time undertaken by the Swiss, who advanced into Franche-Comté and besieged Dijon on September 7th. Its commander, Lateran, saw that resistance was useless and applied himself to bribe the Swiss generals. He made a treaty with them by which Louis XII renounced all claims on Milan and undertook to pay a large ransom. The Swiss received a small instalment and withdrew. But Louis XII refused to ratify the treaty, which is not surprising, and the Swiss felt themselves duped. They cherished an ill will against France, which did France much harm in the future. For the present, however, the double dealing of La Trémouille saved France from imminent disaster. France had suffered severely at Novara, at Terouanne, and at Dijon, but no crushing blow had been struck. Practically, Henry VIII had failed. He had gained glory, but no substantial results. He had set England in a high place in European politics, but had not succeeded in overthrowing the position of France. The blow that he had meditated was one that must be struck swiftly and surely if it was to do its work. Neither Ferdinand nor the Pope wished for the overthrow of France. Both of them were content that things should stay as they were. The great object of Ferdinand was to prevent the growth of the power of the Austrian house. The only heirs to himself and Maximilian were their two grandsons, and Ferdinand wished to secure the division of the Austro-Spanish possessions between them, since he had grown jealous of his eldest grandson Charles, who might in a few years' time revive his father's claims to the regency of Castile. Ferdinand was far-sighted, and was afraid of any accession of power to the Austrian house. He wished to uphold France as the only safeguard, and so strove by intrigues and negotiations to sever the alliance between Henry VIII and Maximilian without causing any open rupture. His promises to Henry VIII were purely delusory. Leo X had been elected pope in the interests of peace, and peace was congenial to his own temper. One of his earliest acts was to appoint as his secretaries two of the most distinguished Latinists of the day, Pietro Bembo and Jacopo Sadoleto, who employed their pens in writing eloquent eulogies of peace to all the sovereigns of Europe. But though Leo X was unwilling to take any part in military efforts, he was none the less watchful of his own interests. First, he secured Parma and Piacenza in return for a subsidy to the Duke of Milan, and he rejoiced over the issue of the Battle of Novara, though he lamented the shedding of Christian blood. In like manner, he sent an envoy to Venice, that he might detach the Venetians from France and reconcile them with Maximilian. He congratulated Henry VIII on his victories over France and Scotland, but expressed his hope that the English king would soon bring his wars to an end and turn his victorious arms against the Turks. The Pope, in fact, mildly approved of everything that was done, and at the same time gently urged counsels of peace. Really, Leo X did not wish for France to be pushed to extremities. He had his own plans about Italian affairs, and his plans could best be carried out by playing off France and Spain against one another. His immediate object was that France should be so far humbled as to turn for help to the Papacy. He naturally wished to see the schism brought to an end and the unity of the Church re-established, and for this purpose carried on the ecclesiastical policy of Julius II. He confirmed the summons of another session of the Lateran Council, which he attended in great pomp. It was a pardonable mark of vanity that on April 26th, the anniversary of the Battle of Ravenna, Leo X rode to the Lateran on the same horse which had borne him when he was made prisoner in the fight. The position was now reversed. No longer captive in the hands of the French, Giovanni de' Medici rode as head of the Christian Church to prepare the way for receiving the submission of France to his authority. The sixth session of the Lateran Council produced the wonted flow of eloquence about the corruption of the times, the need of peace, and of the union of Europe for a crusade against the Turks, and a commission of prelates was appointed to report on the steps to be taken for these laudable objects. But when a demand was made that a citation be issued to absent prelates, meaning the schismatic cardinals, Leo X made no reply, nor did he assent to another proposal for continuing the proceedings for the abolition of the Pragmatic Sanction. He told his master of ceremonies, Paris de Gracie, that he would not take any steps against the French king. He could say so with good reason, for he knew that Louis XII was already desirous to make peace with the Papacy, The Council of Lyons was quite useless as a political weapon, and its proceedings attracted no attention. The death of Julius II removed the motives of personal hostility which had caused the attempted schism. The cardinals at Lyons found that they had lost all consideration, and were only anxious to be reconciled to the new pope. This was so notorious that Henry VIII in April saw that the opening of negotiations between France and the papal court threatened the success of his league. He wrote to Cardinal Bainbridge, bidding him oppose by all means the reconciliation of the schismatic cardinals. Such an act of ill-judged mercy would endanger the papacy in the future, and would strengthen the French party in the Curia. Leo X, however, was not so enamoured of the League as to sacrifice his own interests to its claims. He quietly pursued his negotiations with the schismatic cardinals, who sent to the 7th session of the Council, June 17th, a letter in which they made full submission. The learned Carvajal and the imperious Sanseverino were driven to humble themselves entirely. They confessed their error. They declared the Council of the Lateran to be legitimate. They accepted all its decrees and prayed for its continuance. The fathers of the Council thanked God for such pious sentiments, and left the matter to the Pope. The restoration of Carvajal and Sanseverino was strongly opposed by the ambassadors of Spain and Germany, and by Cardinals Bainbridge and Schiner as representatives of England and the Swiss. But Leo X urged many grounds for mercy. The cardinals had been his friends in his youth. He burned with zeal to sweep away all memories of the schism. His real reason was, as Henry VIII had foreseen, a desire to prepare the way for a reconciliation with Louis XII. So all remonstrances were unheeded, and Leo X paid no heed to the taunt that he did not possess the constancy of his great predecessor. He preferred to show that, at all events, he had a quiet obstinacy of his own. On June 26th, Carvajal and Sanseverino were allowed to enter Rome secretly and occupy rooms in the Vatican. Next day they were admitted to a consistory, but were ordered beforehand to lay aside their red hats and cardinals' attire and appear only in the dress of simple priests. They knelt before the Pope and confessed that they had erred. The Pope pointed out the greatness of their wrongdoing and went through the long list of their offences. Then he gave them a document which contained a full admission of their guilt and stringent promises of future obedience and submission. Carvajal looked through it and said that he would observe its provisions. "Read it aloud," said the Pope. Carvajal in vain strove to obey. The words choked him, and he could only say, "I cannot read aloud, for I am hoarse." "You cannot speak loud," said the Pope sternly, "because you have no good heart. You came here of your own free will. You are free to depart. If you think that the contents of that document are severe, we will send you back to Florence. Take and read it, or be gone." Sanseverino came to his friend's aid and read the schedule in a clear voice. Then they signed it and swore to observe it, after which the Pope restored them to their offices and benefices. Their robes were brought in, and they were vested and went through the ceremony of admission as though they were newly created cardinals. At last the Pope had pity on them and said to Carvajal, "You are like the sheep in the gospel that was lost and is found." Bembo announced to the princes of Europe that the schismatics, breathed on by the breath of a heavenly zephyr, had turned to penitence, and that the schism was at an end. The negotiations between the Pope and the French king went on briskly, ostensibly about ecclesiastical matters, till on October 26th, 1513, Louis XII signed an agreement that the Gallican Church should send representatives to the Lateran Council and there discuss the pragmatic sanction. On December 19th, the Council held its 8th session to receive the submission of France. 2 French ambassadors spoke in the king's name, saying that he had adhered to the Council of Pisa because he thought it a lawful counsel. He saw that the mind of Julius II was poisoned against him, and when certain of the cardinals summoned a council, he recognized it. Now that he had been informed by Leo X that the council was unlawful, he submitted to his paternal admonitions, recognized the council of the Lateran, and asked to be allowed to send proctors to attend its deliberations. His excuses were admitted, and his request was granted. Leo X was content to condone the schism as arising from a personal quarrel between the French king and his predecessor. He did not take his stand on the ground of the ecclesiastical irregularity, but frankly admitted that the affairs of the Church were determined by personal and political considerations. Perhaps it would have been difficult to have done otherwise, but the reconciliation with the schismatic cardinals and with the French king showed the easy complacence of practical statesmanship rather than the dignified severity of the head of a great institution. Henry VIII judged more wisely than did Leo X when he warned him that his lenity, founded on expediency, would give a bad example in the future, would show how little it cost to create a schism, and how useful a weapon against the papacy the threat of a schism afforded. But Leo X did not judge Henry VIII to be a disinterested adviser. In the Pope's eyes, the schism had been a miserable failure, and he thought that he could afford to treat it lightly. Yet his conduct was a dangerous admission of the results of the papal policy, that the system of the Church no longer rested upon a purely ecclesiastical basis. The Pope could listen with an indulgent smile to excuses which rested on nothing save motives of political distrust. He saw nothing that demanded penitence in the recognition of the superiority of a council over an intractable Pope. He regarded it as natural that a king, when hard pressed by a Pope, should use against him any weapon that came to hand. So he accepted the excuses of Louis XII with all lightness of heart. It was not in the nature of a Medici to take his stand upon principles, and the maxims of Medicean statecraft soon wrought irreparable mischief to the system of the Church. The theologians of the Lateran Council may have thought that offences against the government of the Church might well be overlooked in an age which threatened to undermine the foundations of the Christian faith. So widely spread was the interest in philosophic speculation that theology had been driven into the background. Bessarion was the last great scholar who was also a theologian, and the impulse which he gave to the study of Plato turned men's minds for a time into a direction where they were not conscious of any antagonism between philosophy and theology. The Florentine Platonists, Ficino and Pico, tried to establish the unity of thought and weave a vast if shadowy system which harmonized all truth. They ran the risk of explaining away the basis of theology, and their system disappeared before the teaching of Savonarola and the religious movement of which he was a leader. The influence of Plato gradually died away, and Aristotle became the oracle of the new learning. His logical system attracted the humanists, as it had captivated the schoolmen. But the schoolmen applied Aristotle's logic to the construction of an organized theology by the process of deduction from Scripture. The humanists applied it to the solution of their own problems by deduction from Aristotle's metaphysical system. They investigated the nature of the mind and its activity. They pressed into the region of psychology and were not content to observe the limits which theology had set. The Italian mind had long been accustomed to the distinction between the practical and speculative reason, and the Italian found no difficulty in dividing his life into two portions. His conception of political liberty was an equilibrium between two conflicting claims. By recognizing now one and now another, he could best secure the freedom of doing what he thought most convenient. The principles of Italian politics sank deep, and in speculation also, the Italian readily turned from the pursuit of truth as a harmonious whole to the definition of separate spheres for intellectual activity. He did not criticize the established system of theology, but pursued philosophy as an independent branch of knowledge. He was not deterred by conflicts and did not shrink from contradictions. As a professing Christian, he bowed to the authority of the Church. As a philosopher, he claimed to pursue his investigations undisturbed. He combined outward submission with inward revolt, though he was probably sincere in saying that revolt was far from his intention. The Italian had no trouble in leading a detached life. It pleased him to understand all systems, though he was not necessarily under bondage to any. He preferred to be a philosopher in an ordinary way, though he reserved his claim to be a Christian in an emergency. The ecclesiastical authorities had not raised any decided protest against this temper of mind, and the evil was of long standing. The revival of Greek learning had done something toward procuring a better text of Aristotle, and had made known his early commentators, chief of whom was Alexander of Aphrodisias. In earlier times, Aristotle had been known chiefly through the commentaries of the Arabian Averroes, who taught that there was a universal intelligence of which all men partook equally, and from partaking in which man had a soul which was immortal. This doctrine of Averroes was combated by Thomas of Aquino, who refuted the opinion that the soul was one and the same in all the universe, and maintained the separate origin of every human soul. Alexander of Aphrodisias had extended the psychology of Aristotle, and maintained that the soul was mortal like the body. And at the time of the Renaissance, there was no second Thomas of Aquino to answer the newly discovered arguments, so that Alexander was the popular commentator whose views were put forward and whose arguments were readily adopted. Marsilio Ficino conceived that Platonism was the remedy for the heresies caused by the study of the Peripatetics. We have labored, he says, at translating Plato and Plotinus, that by the appearance of this new theology, poets may cease to count the mysteries of religion amongst their fables, and the crowds of Peripatetics, who form almost the whole body of philosophers, may be admonished that religion must not be reckoned as old wives' stories. The world is occupied by the Peripatetics and is divided between their sects, the Alexandrians and the Averroists. The Alexandrians opine that our intelligence is mortal, the Averroists that it is one only. Both equally destroy the foundation of all religion, chiefly because they seem to deny a divine providence over men. If anyone thinks that such a widespread impiety, defended by such keen intellects, can be uprooted merely by the preaching of the faith, he errs greatly, as facts may prove. We need some greater power, either widespread miracles or the discovery of a philosophic religion which may persuade philosophers to give ear to it. So wrote Ficino, and came forward with his offering of a misty effort to set forth the image of Plato as closely resembling the truth of Christ. But his philosophic miracle did not work conviction. His system did not reduce all gainsayers to silence. The question of the immortality of the soul continued to be openly disputed in the schools of Italy, and few were shocked by the discussion. We cannot feel surprised that the theologians in the council determined to make a protest against the reduction of Christian life to a subject of philosophic doubt. They framed a decree which condemned those who assert that the intelligent soul is mortal or one in all men. Scripture requires the belief in an individual soul in each man. Otherwise, the incarnation was useless, and the resurrection was of no effect. Philosophers teaching in universities were bidden, if in their lectures they had to expound the opinions of the ancients, to teach as well the orthodox faith, and resolve the arguments of those who lived without the light of Christianity. Further, no one in holy orders was henceforth to devote a longer space than 5 years to the study of poetry or philosophy, without undertaking also the study of theology or of the canon law. This decree was ordered to be published every year by the ordinaries of university towns and rectors of universities. The protest of the council was certainly couched in mild language. Theologians were content to assert the truth in the face of fashionable skepticism. They did not venture to engage in war in defense of the faith. The decree was hortatory rather than judicial. No means were prescribed for bringing to trial those who disobeyed. A barren protest was issued, nothing more. Theology was almost apologetic in the presence of philosophical atheism, which it denounced in half-hearted language. The decree is a significant testimony to the decay of dogmatic theology. A second decree, providing for the pacification of Europe, was passed without debate. A third, which published a papal constitution for the reformation of ecclesiastical officials, was disappointing to the majority of the prelates. It was the first fruits of the labours of the commissioners, who had been appointed in the previous session, and only enacted in general terms, that all officials should observe the rules of ecclesiastical discipline. When this was put to the vote, one bishop said that it was useless to pass decrees unless abuses were actually removed. Others, amongst whom was Paris de Gracie, said that reform should not be confined to the curia, but was needed in the whole church. When the votes were taken, a considerable minority negatived the decree on the ground that they wished for a thorough reform in head and members. Paris de Gracie told the Pope that the reformers themselves needed reforming. Leo X smiled and said that he must have a little time to see how he could satisfy everyone, and would return to the subject in the next session. The Pope's smile was more significant than his promise. He knew too much of the world to have much interest in reform. His first creation of cardinals showed only too clearly that his policy had more in common with that of Alexander VI than with that of Julius II. Of the 4 cardinals created on September 23, 1513, 2 were literary favourites of Leo X, Lorenzo Pucci and Bernardino Dovizi. The other 2 were near relatives of the Pope, and both of them were men whose appointment was somewhat scandalous. Innocenzo Cibo was the Pope's nephew, son of his sister Maddalena, who had married Francesco Cibo, son of Pope Innocent VIII. In a letter to Ferdinand of Spain, Leo X found it necessary to apologize for raising so young and untried a man to a lofty position. About Innocenzo he writes, "We hope that he will realize our wishes. He has great natural gifts, joined to excellent character, adorned by devotion to literature." Innocenzo was only 21 years old, but Leo X reflected that he himself had gained the cardinalate at a still earlier age, and what I received from Innocent, I repay to Innocent, he said with his usual smile. End of section 23. Section 24 of A History of the Papacy from the Great Schism to the Sack of Rome, Volume 5 by Mandell Creighton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Book 5, Chapter 18, Beginnings of Leo X, 1513 to 1515, Part 3. The creation of Giulio de' Medici was a still more serious matter. Giulio was the reputed son of the Pope's uncle Giuliano, who had been assassinated in the conspiracy of the Pazzi in 1478. After Giuliano's death, his brother Lorenzo was told that he had left behind an illegitimate son who was about a year old. Lorenzo undertook the care of the child, who in due time embraced an ecclesiastical career. Leo X had already nominated him Archbishop of Florence, as he placed much confidence in his political sagacity. Before creating him cardinal, he appointed a secret commission to investigate the circumstances of Giulio's birth. The commissioners duly reported that Giulio was the son of Giuliano and a Florentine woman by name Floretta, that his parents had by mutual consent contracted lawful wedlock and were legally man and wife. On September 20th, a papal decree pronounced Giulio legitimate and removed all technical objections to his elevation to the cardinalate. Leo X was prepared to do for the Medici what Alexander VI had done for the Borgia, but Leo X knew Italy thoroughly, and instead of breaking with current prejudices, meant to use them for his own ends while preserving the appearance of entire decorum. The establishment of the Medicean family was steadily pursued. Leo X proved that his father Lorenzo judged aright when he said, "I have 3 sons, one good, one wise, and one foolish." The folly of Piero had ruined the Medici for a time. The wisdom of Leo X was to restore the fortunes of his house. Meanwhile, the goodness of Giuliano was an obstacle to the Pope's way. Giuliano was too simple and gentle to carry out the organized corruption of Florence, which was the foundation of the Medicean rule. He was summoned to Rome, and the oversight of affairs in Florence was entrusted to Lorenzo, the son of Piero, a youth of 21, whose political career the Pope undertook to direct aright. A paper of instructions was prepared for the young man, ostensibly by Giuliano, but the hand which guided his pen was that of the Pope. Lorenzo was initiated into the mysteries of Medicean statecraft, the control of the elections to the magistracies, the choice of fit instruments, the employment of spies, the means for exercising a constant supervision without seeming to be prominent, the way to flatter the people and establish a despotic power while retaining the forms of a free commonwealth. Giuliano, on his retirement to Rome, had next to be provided for. First, he was made a citizen and baron of Rome, and the festivities which celebrated this honour showed the introduction into Rome of the finer artistic spirit of Florence. The piazza in front of the Capitol was filled with a wooden theatre, which was covered outside with pictures telling of the old connection of the Tuscan city with Rome. In the morning of September 13th, Giuliano was escorted to the Capitol. Mass was said, and the freedom of the city was presented. Then the guests went to a banquet, a formidable entertainment which lasted for 6 hours. When all were satisfied with food and drink, they listened to a pastoral eclogue which praised Leo X and his brother at the expense of Julius II, but was none the less conceived in the spirit of light comedy, and awakened peals of laughter. Then came a lady dressed in cloth of gold and attended by 2 nymphs. She represented Rome, and sang some complimentary verses. She carried a basket of eggs, which at the end of her song she broke and threw among the company, who found them filled with rare perfumes. Next came a huge mountain of cardboard, from which issued a man of great stature who represented the Tarpeian Mount, and carried on his shoulders the lady who personified Rome. The man mountain thanked Giuliano for the honour he had done him, and made way for a car of gold drawn by 2 stalwart nymphs, who were yoked by golden chains and were driven by an old man. In this car sat Justice, Strength, and Fortitude, each of whom had much to say. Then came a second car drawn by lions. In it was seated Cybele with a globe on her lap. The globe was opened and let loose all manner of birds, to the surprise of the beholders. Last came a car on which sat a lady plunged in woe. She was Florence, weeping for her children, whom she vainly implored Cybele to restore. Cybele, to console her, proposed at last that Rome and Florence should confederate, nay, should become one together and enjoy the same rule. Florence and Rome agreed to the proposal, and medals were scattered amongst the crowd to celebrate the happy union. Even in pastimes, the principles of the Medicean domination were expressed. Florence and Rome were to make one state, and by their union the power of the Medici was to be still further extended. Leo X had great schemes for his relatives. He wished to secure for Giuliano the kingdom of Naples, for Lorenzo the duchy of Milan. Under colour of a desire for peace, he negotiated with all the powers of Europe, watching eagerly for his own gain. He was everyone's friend at once, but Ferdinand of Spain understood him well and suggested a comfortable settlement for Giuliano. He might marry a well-born Spanish lady, and might have in Naples the confiscated estates of the Duke of Urbino. The emperor might be induced to give him Modena and Reggio, and the pope could invest him with Ferrara. Leo X hoped for more than this, and continued his general amiability. He offered to reconcile the French king with the Swiss, the emperor with Venice, and at the same time projected an Italian league which would be opposed to both alike. It was one of the maxims of Leo X that when you have made a league with any prince, you ought not on that account to cease from treating with his adversary. So Leo X watched, but could not greatly influence the course of European affairs. The reconciliation of Louis XII with the Papacy deprived the Holy League of its ostensible object, and Ferdinand of Spain made use of that pretext to withdraw still further from the league against France. He first made a truce with France for a year, and then induced the unstable Maximilian to break his promises to Henry VIII, and do the same. The accord of Ferdinand and Maximilian with France was signed at Orleans on March 13th, 1514, and Maximilian even went so far as to pledge himself that Henry VIII would ratify it. Henry VIII was indignant at this breach of faith. He was weary of the craft of his father-in-law Ferdinand, and of the shiftiness of Maximilian. If peace were to be made with France, he would make it in his own way. Leo X sent an envoy to help in the reconciliation. He was always ready to take a friendly part in everything. But the peace between England and France was concluded without much consideration of the Pope. France and England entered into a close alliance, which was cemented by the marriage of Louis XII, who had become a widower in January, with Henry VIII's sister Mary, a girl of 16. Mary had been betrothed by Henry VII to Charles, the grandson of Maximilian and Ferdinand, but Maximilian had shown no particular zeal to carry out the marriage. England now separated from its alliance with the Austro-Spanish house. France was no longer isolated, and the political equilibrium of Europe was again restored. Secure by his alliance with England, Louis XII again talked of an expedition into Italy for the recovery of Milan. True to his general policy, Leo X made one compact with Louis XII and another with the Swiss. He further entered into a secret treaty with Ferdinand of Spain, and sent Bembo to Venice that he might try and detach the Republic from its league with France. These negotiations were conducted with great secrecy. The treaty with France was merely a schedule signed by the Pope and Louis XII. The treaty with Spain was a secret to be entrusted to not more than 3 advisers on each side. The vigorous policy of Julius II was abandoned for one more in keeping with the temper of the age. Leo X, with a genial smile upon his face, pursued his ends by an elaborate system of mine and countermine. If Louis XII succeeded in his Italian plans, then Giuliano might secure the kingdom of Naples. If Louis XII failed, Spain, the Empire, and the Swiss might agree to carve out a new principality from parts of the Milanese and the Duchy of Ferrara. Leo X had no prejudice about means. He was generally sympathetic to all parties and was hopeful for himself. While the Pope was engaged in this tortuous policy, it was scarcely to be expected that the Lateran Council should accomplish any useful results. The promised constitution for the reformation of the prelates and curia was long in appearing, and was the subject of much debate. The winter session of the council was put off because the prelates declared that they would vote against any measures which did not deal with the cardinals as on an equal footing with themselves. The Pope interposed in the interests of peace, and was present at a meeting of prelates when the privileges assumed by the cardinals were loudly attacked. They claimed the right of presenting to benefices which became vacant by the death of anyone in their service, and further assumed the power of reserving to themselves benefices. In the eyes of the prelates, one part of the reformation of the Church was a check upon the power of the cardinals. It was enough that they paid tribute to the Pope. They no longer hoped to escape from that. They were, however, resolved to see that the privileges of the Pope were not extended to the cardinals. Accordingly, when the Pope laid before them some of the provisions which were proposed for enactment, the prelates objected. The Pope, with his usual smile, turned to Paris de Gracie and said, "The prelates are wiser than I am, for I am bound by the cardinals." He agreed to prorogue the session till the prelates and cardinals could agree. A compromise was soon arrived at, that nothing should be said in the reforming constitution which did not apply to prelates and cardinals alike. The council was manifestly divided into 2 parties. The cardinals wished to lord it over the prelates. The prelates were resolved not to admit that the cardinals formed a different order from themselves. On May 6, 1514, the 9th session of the council was at last held. It received the submission of the French prelates and freed them from the penalties of schism. It renewed its exhortations to general peace, and listened to the papal constitution for the reform of the curia, a lukewarm document which laid down general rules of conduct for cardinals and all members of the curia, and condemned pluralities and other flagrant abuses in such a way as to leave sufficient loopholes for their continuance. Then the council was prorogued, that the question of reform might be further considered. Leo X was growing weary of the council. It had served its purpose of ending the schism, and the Pope only awaited a decent pretext for dissolving it. The prelates pursued their protest against the cardinals, and declared that they would vote against every measure brought forward until their grievances were redressed. The Pope had to act as mediator between the conflicting parties, and at length produced a compromise. Even so, the prelates were not satisfied, but raised further complaints of the way in which episcopal jurisdiction was set at naught by the privileges granted to the friars. They demanded that these privileges should be revoked entirely, and put forward a formidable list of monastic aggressions on the episcopal authority, arranged under 80 heads. The chief of their demands were the payment by the monks of 1/4 of what they held in possession, and the abolition of the liberty enjoyed by monks of hearing confessions, performing funerals, and preaching where they would without the license of the bishop. They further wished to restrain the absolute power of jurisdiction over its members possessed by the monastic orders. Unless justice was done within a month, the cause was to pass into the bishop's court. Naturally, the monastic orders resented this attack. The complaints were of long standing. The feud between seculars and regulars lasted through the whole Middle Ages. In former times, monks and friars had been strong in popular support. Now they had become standing objects of ridicule, for their ignorance no less than for their irregular lives, and there was no chance that the quarrel at Rome should agitate Europe. The bishops were stronger than the monks, for they could refuse their votes at the council, and Leo X did not wish to show to Europe discords within the Church. It was useless for the generals of the monastic orders to resist. The Pope advised them to give way and make terms while they had an opportunity. It was impossible for the council to deprive them of all their privileges. This controversy suspended the sessions of the council for an entire year. At last, the Pope besought the bishops to let the matter stand over and allow another session to be held for the purpose of dispatching such business as was ready. He promised that the matter should be settled in the following session. The prelates gave way before this promise, and the Pope was able to hold the 10th session of the council on May 4th, 1515. The decrees passed in this session concern details which are scarcely worthy of a general council. One question was curious. Amongst the charitable institutions of the Middle Ages were establishments for lending money on the security of articles which were put in pledge. These Montes Pietatis, as they were called, took no interest for the money lent, and the expenses of their management were at first defrayed by private charity. As the system spread, it was found desirable to make a charge on each transaction for the purpose of covering the expenses of management. Since the religious sense of the Middle Ages was opposed to usury, the barren breed of money, some men's consciences were stirred by a scruple if it were allowed to make any charge for lending money, which was in itself an act of Christian love. To assuage such principles, a decree of the council declared that it was lawful for charitable institutions to receive payment for their management, and that such payment was not usurious in its character. However, the decrees went on to say, it was better that such institutions should be sufficiently endowed by pious people to enable them to dispense with the need of making any charge on those who benefited by their charity. A second decree was passed to please the bishops and correct disorders which had arisen from the multitude of exemptions from the jurisdiction of ordinaries which had been granted by previous popes. Those who had jurisdiction from the Pope over exempted persons were ordered to exercise it diligently. If they were remiss, the ordinaries were empowered to interfere after giving due warning. The basis of the ecclesiastical jurisdiction was asserted against lay interference, and the regular holding of provincial synods was enforced. All this shows an uneasy sense of the decay of ecclesiastical discipline and a desire to revive it. There was a feeling that the evils of the present time were due to ecclesiastical lenity, but there was no recognition of the fact that papal interference had broken down the ecclesiastical system, and that the system could only be restored by a readjustment of the relations between the papacy and the episcopate. A third decree showed a consciousness of the influence of the new learning in sapping the foundations of the Christian faith. Books of every sort were being multiplied by the printing press. Scurrilous and libelous pamphlets abounded, and many philosophic works paid little heed to the doctrines of the Christian faith. A decree was passed enacting that henceforth no book should be printed which had not received the approval of the bishop and the inquisitor of the city or diocese in which it was published. It was an enactment in keeping with the ideas of the time in which it was passed, and was not likely to be applied with undue severity. In fact, it had little binding power, as it could only be enforced by spiritual penalties. The literature of that age stood in great need of supervision, and prelates themselves were amongst the writers who offended by their moral laxity. We do not find that the decree produced any immediate effect. The ecclesiastical and moral disorders of the time were too deeply seated to be removed by well-intentioned decrees. The Lateran Council was not sufficiently strong, nor sufficiently earnest, to set on foot any real measures of reform, and Pope Leo X was more interested in the politics of the Medicean house than in the well-being of Christendom. End of section 24. Section 25 of A History of the Papacy from the Great Schism to the Sack of Rome, Volume 5, by Mandell Creighton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Book 5, Chapter 19, Francis I in Italy, 1515 to 1516, Part 1. The beginning of the year 1515 brought a political change of great importance. Louis XII was 52 years old and infirm of health at the time of his marriage with Mary of England. He tried to suit his manner of life to the tastes of a vivacious girl of 16. The effort was too great for his strength, and he died on January 1st, 1515, less than 3 months after his marriage. He left no male heir, and his successor, Francis, Duke of Angoulême, his nephew, was a young man of 20 who burned with a desire to win martial fame. France could only look with shame on the foreign policy of Louis XII, whose failure in Italy had been ignominious. He had shown himself unscrupulous and treacherous. He had sacrificed his allies. He had humiliated himself before the Pope. He had sent armies and had been responsible for brutal massacres, but the sum of his efforts, his treachery, and his humiliations had been the loss of the French possessions in Italy and the disgrace of the French name. It is no wonder that Gaston de Foix had become the hero of the young nobles of France, and that Francis I longed to emulate his glorious career. Italy might hear with equanimity that Louis XII was preparing a new invasion. It was a more serious matter when the invasion was to be conducted by the young Francis I in the first flush of his martial zeal. At the same time as the accession of Francis I, another prince began his career. The Archduke Charles of Austria was called by the Flemish estates to enter upon the government of the Netherlands. Though he was only 15 years old, his rule was more likely to secure peace for the Netherlands than was that of the regent Margaret, the widowed daughter of Maximilian, who was devoted to the interests of the Austrian house. Cold, self-contained, industrious, but to all appearance dull, the young Charles undertook a difficult task. He had been brought up to regard France as his hereditary enemy. He had never forgotten that he was the heir of the Burgundian house, which France had robbed of its fairest possessions. But the ruler of the Netherlands was powerless against France, which could raise up enemies on its borders and attack it at will. Charles saw that he must bide his time, and Francis I showed a condescending patronage. He wished to be at peace with his neighbours, that he might have his hands free for his Italian campaign, and proposed an alliance with Charles, which Charles was ready to accept. Francis I had married Claude, daughter of Louis XII. Charles was offered the hand of her younger sister Renée, a child of 4 years old. There were long negotiations about her dower, and the age when the marriage was to be celebrated. Neither party was in earnest in wishing for friendship, and it was agreed that Renée was to be handed over to her husband at the age of 12. Many things might happen in the interval of 8 years. For the same reason, Francis I. was anxious to maintain the peace with England, and Henry VIII. Had no reason for becoming his enemy. The treaty with Louis XII. Was renewed, though Henry VIII. Looked with a jealous eye on the prospect of French aggrandisement. At the same time, Francis I. renewed the league between France and Venice. On the other side, Ferdinand of Aragon was especially anxious to oppose the French designs in Italy. He proposed a league between Spain, the Empire, the Swiss, the Duke of Milan, and the Pope. Leo X. was the most difficult person to fix. He was engaged, as usual, in negotiating with both sides at once. He continued his dealings with France, where a matrimonial alliance had been proposed between Giuliano de' Medici and Filiberta of Savoy, sister of Louise, the mother of Francis I., who was all-powerful with her son. Leo X. conferred on his brother Parma and Piacenza, as well as Modena, which he had bought from the needy Maximilian for 40,000 ducats. Giuliano's marriage with Filiberta took place in February 1515, and Leo X. was anxious to see what Francis I. proposed to do for his new relative. On this depended the Pope's action. Until he saw his definite advantage on one side or the other, he cautiously listened to both. His envoy in France was Ludovico Canossa, Bishop of Tricarico, who vainly endeavoured to induce Francis I. to offer as a bribe for the Pope's friendship the conquest of the kingdom of Naples for Giuliano. The peace with Flanders and with England left Francis tolerably free, and made him hesitate to incur so heavy an obligation in the Pope's behalf. He expressed his wish to make the Pope the most powerful Pope that ever had been, but he said that the question of Naples was one of grave importance, which could not be decided at present. Before Canossa had begun these negotiations, the Pope was listening to proposals for a league with Maximilian, Ferdinand, the Duke of Milan, Florence, Genoa, and the Swiss. The league comprised also the family of the Medici, who were counted as having substantial interests of their own. Its ostensible objects were war against the Turk and the defence of the Pope. Leo X. ratified it on February 22nd, and conferred on the Swiss the title of Protectors of Religious Liberty, but he kept secret, even from his trusty friends, the part he took concerning it. Cardinal Bibbiena wrote to Giuliano that the Pope was not willing to accept this league, but thought that he himself ought to take the lead in all things that concerned Christendom, and ought not to follow others. Really, Leo X. did not expect that Francis I. would come to Italy that year, and wished to use the league as a means of obtaining his assent to the proposal about Naples. Francis I. secretly pushed on his preparations, which England viewed with increasing jealousy. Leo X. was strengthened by the hostile attitude of England, and hoped that Henry VIII. Also would join the league. Henry VIII. Had no grounds for openly breaking off his alliance with France, but he nevertheless listened to the Pope's proposal. He had for some time been pressing the Pope to create his minister Thomas Wolsey a cardinal, and though Leo X. was reluctant to grant this request, circumstances favoured the king. The English Cardinal Bainbridge, Archbishop of York, had died at Rome in July 1514. There were signs of poisoning. The body was examined by the Pope's command, and the doctor's examination confirmed the belief that the cardinal had been poisoned. Suspicion fell upon one Rinaldo of Modena, a priest who was in the cardinal's employment in some inferior office. Rinaldo had formerly been attached to the household of Silvestro de' Gili, the English agent in the Roman court, who was rewarded for his services by the bishopric of Worcester. Bainbridge was a hot-tempered, arrogant, and overbearing man, and there was no love lost between him and Gili. It was suspected that Gilles had employed Rinaldo to poison Bainbridge. The accused was imprisoned and tortured. He confessed a long career of crime, thefts, and many other misdoings. He had put poison into the cardinal's pottage at the desire of the Bishop of Worcester, who gave him 15 ducats as a reward. This confession was made in the hopes of saving his life. When he was told that he should have pardon for all his other offences, save the death of the cardinal, he committed suicide in prison with a knife which he had managed to conceal. It was not unlikely, as Gilles urged, that Rinaldo was mad, and committed the murder to escape detection of his thefts. Anyhow, neither Henry VIII nor Wolsey believed in Gilles' guilt, and Wolsey wrote to him confidentially at the time when he was labouring under this serious charge. Leo X, after investigation, solemnly acquitted him. Wolsey's support in this emergency laid Gilles under a deep obligation to his patron, and he strove to show his gratitude by urging on the Pope Wolsey's nomination to the cardinalate. Henry VIII wrote and expressed his strong sense of Wolsey's merits, and his ardent desire to see him advanced to a dignity which he well deserved. But Leo X hesitated. English cardinals were not very popular at Rome, and the overbearing conduct of Cardinal Bainbridge had not increased their popularity. Leo X did not wish to admit into the college so powerful a man as Wolsey. He wished to fill it with creatures of his own, and was not sorry to keep suspended before the great minister of the English king a tempting bait, which might be a guarantee of his devotion to the Pope's interests. But Wolsey was a stronger man than Leo X, and knew how to force the Pope's hand. When in July the French forces were actually on the march to Italy, Leo X felt somewhat alarmed, and Wolsey gave him a significant hint. He wrote to the Bishop of Worcester that Henry VIII marvelled at the long delay in sending the cardinal's hat. The sooner he sent it, the better the king would be pleased. If the king forsook the Pope at this time, he would be in greater danger than was Julius II years ago. This argument was weighty with the timorous Pope, and he agreed to make Wolsey cardinal on condition that the King of England entered the League. Henry VIII could not as yet declare himself openly against France, but he joined the League for the ostensible purpose of an expedition against the Turk, and Wolsey's cardinalate was secure. The cardinals still objected, but they were powerless against the Pope's will and the political necessities of the time. They murmured that the English were insolent, that Wolsey would not be content with the cardinalate, but would demand also the office of papal legate in England. In a spirit of prophecy, they said, if this be granted to him, the Roman court is undone. On September 10th, 1515, Wolsey was created cardinal, and was the one person who received that distinction. It was indeed time for the Pope to strengthen himself by new alliances, for the example of his double dealings began to affect those whom he trusted in Italy. Ottaviano Fregoso had been set up as Doge of Genoa in opposition to the French, and the Pope had supported him. But he also negotiated with both parties at once, and his open defection to the side of France secured the French army a basis on the coast, which was of great importance to their military operations. Ottaviano Fregoso wrote to the Pope to justify his change of policy, and ended his defence by saying, "If I were writing to private persons, or to a prince who measured state affairs by the same measure as private matters, I should find my justification more difficult. But writing to a prince who surpasses his contemporaries in wisdom, and who therefore knows that I have no other way to maintain my position, it is superfluous to excuse myself to one who is conversant with the lawful, or at least customary, action of princes, not only for preservation, but also for the increase of their states." There could be no more crushing retort on the lessons of the political action of Leo X. The French army assembled in Dauphiné in the course of July, and numbered nearly 60,000 footmen and 50,000 horsemen. Amongst its generals were Trivulzio, Lautrec, and La Palisse, who were well experienced in Italian warfare, besides the Spaniard Pietro Navarro, who had been taken prisoner in the battle of Ravenna, and whom the avaricious King of Spain refused to ransom. Against them were the troops of Spain under Cardona, the papal forces under Giuliano de' Medici, the Milanese army commanded by Prospero Colonna, and the Swiss commanded by Cardinal Schinner. The troops were all of them interested in protecting their own territories rather than in defending Milan. Cardona took up a position near Verona to prevent a junction of the Venetian army with the French. The papal forces advanced to the Po for the protection of Piacenza and Reggio. Only the Swiss went to the front and took up positions guarding the passes of Mont-Cenis and Mont-Ginevre. Trivulzio, finding that the passes were closely watched, tried a new and difficult way across the Alps and descended the valley of the Stura. The Swiss, who were waiting at Susa, heard that the foe had passed by them and were safely posted at Cuneo. So unexpected was this rapid movement of the French that Prospero Colonna, who was on his way to join the Swiss, was surprised and taken prisoner at Villafranca on August 15th. The Swiss were discouraged at the failure of their first designs. Francis I, on his part, was desirous of making peace with such dangerous foes, and opened negotiations for that purpose. But the arrival of new adventurers eager for booty, and the exertions of Cardinal Schinner, broke off the negotiations. The Swiss, who numbered about 35,000 men, retired to Milan and waited for their allies. But neither Cardona nor Lorenzo de' Medici, who had succeeded his uncle Giuliano in command of the papal troops, would come to their aid. Leo X had already begun to renew negotiations with Francis I, and his messenger, with all his dispatches, had fallen into Cardona's hands. When Cardona saw that the Pope did not mean to commit himself, he hesitated in turn, and the Spanish and papal generals each tried to persuade the other to cross the Po. Meanwhile, the French army took up a position at Marignano, between Milan and Piacenza, while the Venetians under Alviano made use of Cardona's withdrawal from Verona to cross the Adige and advance along the left bank of the Po to Lodi. By this movement the communications between the Swiss and their allies were completely intercepted, while the Venetian forces were so placed as to support the French. On the night of September 13th, an alarm was raised in Milan that the French were advancing. The Swiss were at once under arms, and the few horse who had come to reconnoitre rapidly withdrew. The Swiss assembled in the piazza to discuss their plans, for the sturdy republicans maintained, even in war, their habits of federal council. Long time they debated, for they were much divided. Some were in favour of a peace with France. Some wished to withdraw quietly from the matter, but the majority were eager to fight. It was agreed that they should attack the French camp, and the Swiss army set out at once to fulfil their resolution. Some withdrew, but after they had gone a few miles, some Milanese officers rode after them, calling out that the French were already in flight. At this news they turned back, and when they reached the field of battle, threw in their lot with their comrades. It was late in the afternoon when the Swiss reached the French army, which was taken by surprise at this unexpected onslaught. The Swiss had no artillery and wore little armour for defence. They trusted to nothing save weight of their column and their pikes for close quarters. The French cannon were posted on the right wing, guarded by 20,000 German Landsknechts. On the left wing were 12,000 Gascon bowmen. Artillery and crossbow alike played on the Swiss and wrought havoc on their unprotected line, but could not break their steady advance. They seized 4 pieces of artillery and succeeded in coming to close quarters with their foes. A desperate fight went on in the gathering twilight, till both sides were wearied and overcome with thirst and hunger, and each man lay down to sleep where he fought, scarcely a stone's cast from his foe. As soon as morning began to break, the combat was renewed. The Swiss fought with desperate courage. Each man died where he set his foot. The French were well nigh overborne by fatigue when Alviano appeared with reinforcements in their rear. Those of the Swiss who had doubted about the battle began to withdraw, and the retreat became general. But even in their flight the Swiss showed their heroic spirit. It was a marvel, says a Milanese, to see the routed Swiss return to Milan. One had lost an arm, another a leg, a third was maimed by the cannon. They carried one another tenderly, and seemed like the sinners whom Dante pictures in the 9th circle of the Inferno. As fast as they came, they were directed to the hospital, which was filled in half an hour, and all the neighbouring porches were strewn with straw for the wounded, whom many Milanese, moved with compassion, tenderly succoured. In the records of the times we rarely find such heroism and such humanity. The Milanese had little cause to love the Swiss, who treated them brutally and exacted from them heavy taxes, and the mass of the Milanese were prepared to welcome the French as their deliverers. But in the hour of suffering and disaster they showed their respect for the valiant and their charity to the suffering. End of section 25. Section 26 of A History of the Papacy from the Great Schism to the Sack of Rome, Volume 5 by Mandell Creighton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Book 5, Chapter 19, Francis I in Italy, 1515 to 1516, Part 2. The Battle of Marignano produced on all sides a profound impression. Trivulzio said that he had fought in 18 battles, but they were mere child's play compared to this, which was a battle of giants. The Swiss left 10,000 dead upon the field. The French loss was about 7,000, but it was severely felt, as there was scarcely a noble family in France which did not suffer. The Battle of Marignano was a triumph of the old military organization over the Republican army, which had so long been invincible in Italy. As the Hussite army had been the terror of the German nobles, so the Swiss footmen seemed invincible, and boasted themselves to be the tamers and correctors of princes. The Battle of Marignano was a check to the spread of republican ideas, because it dispelled the charm of success which had hitherto accompanied the republican organization in war. By this battle the way was cleared for the assertion in European affairs of the monarchical principle. The defeat of the Swiss at Marignano rendered possible the long warfare of Francis I and Charles V. The repulse of the Swiss seemed at first almost incredible, and military experts accounted for it by the lack of fortunate circumstances. Had daylight lasted a little longer on the first day of the battle, they would have routed the French. Had they not suffered from previous dissensions, when Alviano appeared on the second day, they would still have won. Had Cardona made any movement to support them, their victory would have been secure. Leo X does not seem to have thought a defeat of the Swiss to be possible. The first news that reached Rome announced their victory, and Cardinal Bibbiena illuminated his house and gave a banquet. When contradictory rumours were brought, they were not believed. At last the Venetian envoy received dispatches from his government. He went in the early morning to the Vatican, while the Pope was still in bed. At his urgent request, the Pope was roused and came in half-dressed. "Holy Father," said Giorgi, "yesterday you gave me bad news and false. Today I will give you good news and true. The Swiss are defeated." The Pope took the letters and read them. "What will become of us, and what of you?" he exclaimed. Giorgi tried to console him, though he felt little sympathy with his grief. "We will put ourselves in the hands of the Most Christian King," said the Pope, "and will implore his mercy." Everyone knew that it was the custom of popes nowadays to be always on the winning side. Leo X had already opened negotiations with Francis I, who did not wish to have the Pope for his open foe. It is true that after the battle of Marignano the conquest of Milan was easy, and on October 4th, 1515, Massimiliano Sforza surrendered the castle and agreed to live in France on a pension allowed him by the French king. But the Emperor Maximilian still held to the imperial claims to Milan. The Swiss still talked of sending reinforcements. Henry VIII of England had complaints against France for its intervention in Scotland, and made naval preparations which betokened a descent on the French coast. Francis I did not see his way clear to a march upon Naples, and if he was not prepared for that step, an alliance with the Pope was the best means of securing what he had already won. Accordingly, the Bishop of Tricarico again set to work to negotiate, and Leo X used his assumed terror of the French as a means of putting pressure upon his other allies. He told Ferdinand of Spain that he had thoughts of fleeing to Gaeta, and Ferdinand was moved to answer that the Church was always strongest when she seemed most feeble. For himself, he would give 1,000 lives and 1,000 states, if he had them, to avert danger from such an excellent pope as Leo X. Hypocrisy could go no further on either side, but such like empty talk enabled Leo X to gain time in his dealings with France. He put a good face on the matter, bargained about the terms of the accord, and even recalled the Bishop of Tricarico to Rome for a personal conference. Finally, the terms were signed on October 13th. The Pope was bound to withdraw his troops from Parma and Piacenza, which he had gained at the expense of the Duchy of Milan. On the other hand, Francis undertook to defend the Pope and the Medici in Florence, and give Giuliano and Lorenzo de' Medici revenues in France and military commands. At the same time, Francis I expressed a desire for a conference with the Pope. He hoped to win him over to sanction his invasion of Naples. Leo X also had many schemes about which he wished to sound the French king. He did not, however, think that the presence of Francis in Rome was desirable, as the passage of French troops through Florentine territory might be dangerous. He prepared to advance to Bologna and there meet the king. Yet no sooner had Leo X made this agreement than he proceeded to make apologies for it. He was driven to take this step to escape from ruin. When he could gain an opportunity, he would do all he could to rid Italy of the French. Leo X was nothing if he was not deceitful. In the beginning of November, Leo X set out from Viterbo on his way to Bologna. He left as his legate in Rome Cardinal Soderini, not because he loved him, but because he wished to find a pretense for not allowing him to visit Florence, where the Pope arrived on November 30th. The Florentines had worked hard to give him a splendid reception, and the magnificent decorations which were erected along the streets were long a subject of wonder throughout Italy. Florence employed her architects, her sculptors, and her painters to devise and adorn these structures of a day. The city gate was transformed into a splendid entrance to a palace. The whole of the Piazza di Santa Trinità was occupied by a wooden castle. The unfinished façade of the cathedral was supplied by a wooden covering devised by Jacopo Sansovino and painted in chiaroscuro, with bas-relief and sculptured figures by the hand of Andrea del Sarto. Boccio Bandinelli, Antonio di San Gallo, Granacci, and many others were employed in these works, and the Florentines prided themselves not so much on the lavish gilding bestowed on their decorations as on their grace and beauty of design, all wrought by the hands of good masters. The Florentines were put upon their mettle, and were resolved that no expense or labour should be spared. They had all the feelings of a mercantile community of the present day, and rejoiced in overcoming the difficulties which arose from the short notice of the papal visit. More than 2,000 workmen were employed day and night. More than 70,000 florins were expended. Great space was required for workshops where such vast constructions could be put together, and they did not scruple to make use of their churches for this purpose. For more than a month before the Pope's visit, divine service had to be performed in any remote corner that could be found. It was a strange way of showing honour to the head of the Christian Church. Florence, which was under the yoke of the Medici, might show honour to a Medicean pope. But Bologna was always rebellious to the papal rule, and still resented the expulsion of the Bentivogli. The people showed no signs of joy at the Pope's entry. The magistrates sent only a paltry wooden cross for the Pope to kiss, and though they provided one baldacchino of silk for the Pope himself, a second, which was to be borne over the consecrated elements, was only made of old cloth. When the Pope saw it, he ordered the silken covering to be used for the sacrament, while he himself had none. Paris de Gracie, in his indignation, begged the Pope to punish this ignorant and barbarous folk, but the Pope only smiled. Leo X was not a man to be much moved by a petty slight. On December 11th, 1515, Francis I entered Bologna and was met by all the cardinals. In vain Paris de Gracie strove to inform him of his ceremonial duties and to organize his advance. The king horrified the master of the ceremonies by saying that he did not care about processions. He made his way good-humouredly through the crowd to the palace where the Pope sat awaiting him in full consistory. He was formally received and made profession of his obedience, and when the formal ceremony was over, the Pope and the king retired to their own rooms. Then Leo X went to pay a private visit to the king, not without a warning from Paris de Gracie that he was to beware of the example of Alexander VI, and not remove his cap in the king's presence, for the vicar of Christ should show no signs of reverence to king or emperor. During the public ceremonies of this interview, a noticeable incident took place. Leo X celebrated Mass and administered the communion to some of the French nobles. That the Pope's labour might not be excessive, the number was limited to 40. One of the French barons, who was not admitted to this privilege, cried out that at least he wished to confess to the Pope. He confessed that he had borne arms against Julius II, and had not heeded his censures. The king exclaimed that he had been guilty of the like offence, and all the French lords followed his example. Leo X gave them absolution and his blessing. Then Francis I continued, "Holy Father, do not wonder that all these were the enemies of Pope Julius, because he was our chief enemy, and we have not known in our time a more terrible adversary in war than was Pope Julius, for he was in truth a most skilful captain, and would have made a better general of an army than a Pope of Rome." Even in his religious acts, a pope was pursued by the secular policy of his predecessor. Nay, his religious acts themselves had become part of his own secular designs. Each pope had plans of his own, and paid little heed to the reputation of those who had gone before him in his office. Excommunication and absolution were alike weapons of promoting worldly interests. The Pope felt no shame at being reminded of the fact, and laymen felt no scruple in avowing their knowledge of it. One act of complaisance to Francis I was performed by Leo X On December 14th, Adrian de Boissy, brother of the king's tutor and secretary, was created cardinal. What were the real subjects of the secret conference between pope and king we do not know. The ostensible subject was the establishment of peace between France, Venice, and the emperor, with a view to an expedition against the Turks. But matters more directly concerning the interests of both parties were discussed. Francis I tried in vain to win the pope's assent to an expedition against Naples. That question had to stand over for the present. Leo X thought it hard that he should be required to abandon Parma and Piacenza, but Francis I was resolved to maintain intact the integrity of the Milanese state, and he further demanded that Leo X should resign Modena and Reggio to the Duke of Ferrara. Such a claim was reasonable, for Francis I could not fairly desert his ally, and the peace of Italy would be endangered if a grievance was left needlessly open. Leo X agreed to hand over these cities on condition that he received back the money which he had paid for them to Maximilian. In return for this sacrifice, Francis I was driven to consent to the pope's plan of indemnifying himself by seizing the lands of the Duke of Urbino. Leo X, in fact, wished to revert to the policy of Alexander VI, and was bent upon forming a principality for Lorenzo de' Medici. He could not get Naples. His attempt on Parma and Piacenza and Modena had failed. There remained Urbino as a possibility, and here Francis I was driven to promise that he would allow the pope a free hand. Besides these questions concerning Italian politics, there stood over for discussion the ecclesiastical affairs of France. The Lateran Council had denounced the old grievance of the Pragmatic Sanction. The king and the pope, aided by the French chancellor Duprat, discussed a project by which each of them should make his profit at the expense of the Gallican Church. On December 15th, Francis I left Bologna, and the pope departed a few days later. Neither of them was much satisfied with the interview. Neither had persuaded the other that his interests lay in a cordial understanding between them. Francis I already felt the difficulties of Italian politics. His success at Marignano had raised enemies against him on every side. He had not followed up his victory at once, and hesitation was fatal to future progress. Had he, after the fight of Marignano, marched against Cortona and Lorenzo de' Medici, he might have reduced the pope to submission and advanced unhindered to Naples. He was not prepared for so bold a stroke, and his army rapidly dispersed. Henry VIII and Ferdinand drew closer together. The Swiss talked of another expedition. Even Maximilian bestirred himself. The pope recovered from his terror and again presented conditions to the conqueror. Francis I was content to keep what he had won, and early in 1516 returned to France, leaving the Duke of Bourbon governor of Milan. Leo X journeyed to Florence, where he again enjoyed the magnificence of his native city. But Florence was suffering from a bad harvest, and there was great scarcity of food, so that the pope's followers could not afford to stay in the city. Leo X took no measures for importing corn, and the people saw with growing discontent the unthinking luxury of the pope and cardinals in a time of general distress. At last, on February 19th, the pope departed for Rome. He ordered Paris de Gracie, who was shocked by the command, to go a week earlier, escorting the sacrament, which was generally carried before the pope's person. He preferred to make his way back to Rome without any signs of his pontifical dignity. Soon after his return, he received the news of the death of his brother Giuliano at Fiesole on March 17th. Giuliano had been ailing for some months, and his death was not unexpected. However much Leo X may have grieved, he was warned by the master of ceremonies that it was unbecoming for a pope, who was not a mere man but a demigod, to show any outward sign of mourning. Giuliano's death was sincerely deplored in Florence. He was a good man, writes a Florentine, averse from bloodshed and from every vice. He may be called not only liberal but prodigal, for he made gifts and incurred expenses without any consideration whence the money was to come. He surrounded himself with ingenious men, and wished to make proof of every new thing. Painters, sculptors, architects, alchemists, mining engineers were all hired by him at salaries which it was impossible to pay. He was the worthiest of the Medici family, and was too simple and sincere to share in his brother's plans. His death removed an obstacle from the Pope's ways, for Giuliano was strongly opposed to the scheme of dispossessing the Duke of Urbino. When in exile, he had taken refuge in the court of Urbino. He remembered with gratitude the kindness of Duke Guidobaldo, and would not have his daughter wronged. As he lay on his deathbed, he besought the Pope not to do any ill to the Duke of Urbino, but remember the kindness which was shown to the house of Medici after they were driven from Florence. The Pope soothed him and said, "You must do your best to get well again, and then we can talk about such things." But he refused to make any promise to his dying brother. End of section 26. Section 27 of A History of the Papacy, from the Great Schism to the Sack of Rome, Volume 5, by Mandell Creighton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Book 5, Chapter 19. Francis I in Italy, 1515 to 1516, Part 3. Before taking any definite steps in the matter of Urbino, Leo X waited to see the turn that events would take in Milan. While he was making professions of friendship to Francis I at Bologna, he was privy to a scheme for the reconquest of Milan by his foes. Francis I wished to secure what he had won by making peace with the Swiss, and his emissaries were busy among the cantons. This awakened the jealousy of Henry VIII, who did not wish to see Francis I with his hands free for further exploits, and an English envoy, Richard Pace, was sent with English gold to hire Swiss troops for the service of Maximilian. Henry VIII would not openly break the peace between England and France, but he offered to supply Maximilian with Swiss troops for an attack upon Milan. It was useless to send money to Maximilian, who would have spent it on himself, and Pace had a difficult task in discharging his secret mission so as to devote his supplies to their real purpose. He was helped by Cardinal Scina and the condottiere Galeazzo Visconti. So skilful was he that at the beginning of March the joint army of Maximilian and the Swiss assembled at Trent. On March 24, 1516, they were within a few miles of Milan, and their success seemed sure, when suddenly Maximilian found that his resources were exhausted and refused to proceed. Next day he withdrew his troops and abandoned his allies. Whether he was afraid of a determined resistance on the part of the French, who burnt the suburbs of Milan in preparation for a siege, whether he feared that his Swiss allies might refuse to fight against their comrades in the pay of France, whether he was himself bought off by French gold, we cannot tell. Most probably he only began to count the cost of his enterprise when he saw it close at hand. He bargained for an immediate victory, and when he saw signs of resistance, he shrank before the risk of a possible failure. He was not prepared for anything heroic. According to his wont, says Vittori, he executed a right about face. The expedition was a total failure. Yet English gold had not been spent in vain, as the Swiss were prevented from entirely joining the French, and Francis I was reminded that his position in Italy was by no means secure. Leo X, meanwhile, in the words of Pace, had played marvellously with both hands in this enterprise. He entered into a defensive alliance with Francis I, but sent no help to Milan, so that Francis I said to the papal envoy, "Agreements made with the Pope are to be observed only in time of peace, not in time of war." But though the Pope would give no aid that cost him anything, he was willing to show his friendliness in dishonourable ways. He informed the French king of the intentions of Henry VIII, with a barefaced apology for his breach of faith. Although it does not seem a pastor's duty to make such reports, still the love which His Holiness bears to the Most Christian King, and the business now in hand, drive him to give information of the truth. But he would not have it quoted for the world. At the same time he wrote to the Swiss that the King of France was his ally, and that all who warred against him were enemies of the Church. And after Maximilian's departure, Lorenzo de' Medici furnished money to pay the Swiss who were in the French service. On the other hand, he remonstrated with the Venetian envoy in Rome on the danger which Venice was running by advancing to the aid of the French, and he even allowed Marcantonio Colonna to join Maximilian with 200 men. Afterwards he took credit with Maximilian for sending him, and at the same time protested to Francis I that he went against his will as a private person. But the supreme exhibition of Leo X's diplomatic perfidy is to be found in the instructions given to Cardinal Dovizi, who was sent as an envoy ostensibly to make peace between Maximilian and Francis I. Cardinal Medici wrote to him that the Pope, on the whole, would rather have the French in Milan than the Germans, because more pretexts could be found for opposing the French than the imperial claims. Peace between France and Germany, though at first sight it might seem desirable, was not for the advantage of the Papacy, for it would establish in Italy the power of the Austro-Spanish house. Dovizi was therefore ordered to act carefully in the face of the actual events. If the French were victorious, he was to plead a sudden indisposition and not advance further. If the imperial army prospered, or seemed likely to prosper, he was to go on, but send a secret messenger to the Duke of Bourbon to assure him that he was going to act in the joint interests of France and the Papacy. No wonder that the Pope explained his own policy by saying that it seemed good to him to proceed by temporizing and dissembling like the rest. It was his modesty which prevented him from saying that he outstripped his competitors in those arts. He even had the effrontery afterwards to inform Francis I that he had sent no legate to Maximilian, while he demanded Maximilian's gratitude for having hastened to send one at once. Truly, Leo X spared no pains to be on the winning side. When the dread of disturbance in North Italy was over, Leo X turned his attention to his schemes against the Duke of Urbino. He issued a monitory accusing him of his past misdeeds, his treachery towards Julius II, and his murder of Cardinal Alidossi, especially his refusal to bear arms under Lorenzo de' Medici when the papal troops advanced against the French. It is true that Francesco della Rovere gave the Pope some ground for complaint. He resented his deposition from the office of Gonfaloniere of the Church, and though he was willing to serve under Giuliano de' Medici, as being an old friend, he had declined to serve under Lorenzo, and had made overtures to Francis I. On these grounds, Leo X summoned him to appear in Rome and answer the charges preferred against him, and when he paid no heed, he was excommunicated and deprived of his states. The papal troops, to the number of 20,000, were directed against the Duchy of Urbino, and Francesco, finding himself without allies, fled to Mantua. On May 30th, Lorenzo de' Medici entered Urbino, and in a few months all the fortresses surrendered to him. On August 18th, Leo X solemnly created Lorenzo Duke of Urbino and Lord of Pesaro, with the assent of all the cardinals, save the Venetian Grimani, Bishop of Urbino, who, however, so dreaded the Pope's resentment that he removed from Rome and did not return during the Pope's lifetime. So far, Leo X had been enabled to work his will, because the scheme of Francis I for the conquest of Naples had been made more possible by the death, on January 23rd, 1516, of Ferdinand of Spain. The hand that had so long striven to maintain the balance of power in Europe was removed, and Francis I could count upon dealing with a youth whose counsellors were incapable of any far-seeing objects. It was lucky for Charles V that his grandfather died at a time when the power of France had again become alarming to Europe. Ferdinand's care in his late years had been directed to prevent the growth of the Austrian house, and he had designed to divide his heritage between his two grandsons, Charles and Ferdinand. But after the Battle of Marignano he changed his will, and bequeathed all to Charles, who at the age of 17 found himself ruler of Spain, the Netherlands, Naples, and the colonies of the New World. Yet with all these possessions, the new king was almost destitute of resources. He had not even money to enable him to make a journey to Spain for his coronation. Had not Henry VIII stirred Maximilian to attack Milan, Francis I would have seized a favourable opportunity for the invasion of Naples. England was now the chief opponent of the ambitious schemes of France, and aimed at bringing about a league with Maximilian, Charles, the Pope, and the Swiss. But Charles's ministers, chief of whom was Croix, Lord of Chievres, had a care above all for the interests of Flanders, and so was greatly under the influence of France. Charles was at peace with France. They were of opinion that by maintaining that peace, the young king would more surely assure himself of the succession to Spain. France and England entered into a diplomatic warfare over the alliance with Charles. First, England, on April 19th, recognized Charles as King of Spain, Navarre, and the two Sicilies. Then Wolsey strove to make peace between Venice and Maximilian as a first step toward detaching Venice from its French alliance. Maximilian tried to fire the imagination of Henry VIII and draw money from him by making a fantastic proposal. He would make over to Henry VIII his claims on the Duchy of Milan, would help him to conquer it, would then escort him to Rome, resign in his favour the imperial crown, and spend the rest of his days as Henry's subordinate. But English diplomacy was not attracted by such far-reaching schemes. "Whilst we look for the crown imperial," wrote Pace, "we might lose the crown of England, which is this day more esteemed than the emperor's crown and all his empire." Pace regarded the proposal at its true value, an inventive for to pluck money from the king craftily. Maximilian, in fact, had ceased to be a serious politician, and Charles and Chievres paid little heed to him. They considered that under present circumstances an alliance with France was more secure than a league against her. It would at all events give them time. So negotiations were secretly carried out, and on August 13th the Treaty of Noyon concluded between Francis I and Charles. Charles was to marry Louise, the daughter of Francis I, an infant of 1 year old, and receive as her dower the French claims on Naples. Venice was to pay Maximilian 200,000 ducats for Brescia and Verona. In case he refused this offer and continued the war, Charles was at liberty to help his grandfather, and Francis I to help the Venetians, without any breach of the peace now made between them. Henry VIII was chagrined at this result, and began to be suspicious of the constancy of Maximilian. He strove more ardently than before to make peace between Maximilian and Venice, and to win over the Swiss. The Pope's help was necessary, but the Pope set a high price upon it. He would do what England wished, if thereby he could gain the restoration of Parma and Piacenza. Indeed, he longed for English help to set Lorenzo de' Medici in the Duchy of Milan. As usual, he was cautious in undertaking any obligation, and steadily urged his own interests. On October 29th, an alliance was made between Henry VIII and Maximilian for the defence of the Church, and it was so framed that Charles could enter it also without breaking the Treaty of Noyon. The Cardinal of Sion was active in winning over many of the Swiss, but Leo X professed to be afraid to commit himself. He knew sooner than did Henry VIII that Maximilian was preparing to join the Treaty of Noyon, and consequently grew cooler in his relations to England, and more cordial toward France. On November 11th, Cardinal Medici wrote that any misunderstanding or suspicion was alien to the Pope's nature and will, which wished to give itself without reserve and to meet with a like return. Such a message was rather a severe trial even for the experienced diplomatist Ludovico Canossa, now Bishop of Bayeux, who was to deliver it to the French king. In spite of the efforts of England, Francis I was everywhere successful in settling his difficulties. On November 29th, a perpetual peace was made at Fribourg between France and the Swiss cantons. On December 3rd, the Treaty of Noyon was renewed, and Maximilian was included in its provisions. Peace was made between him and Venice by the provision that Maximilian was to hand over Verona to Charles, who in turn should give it up to the King of France, who delivered it to the Venetians. Maximilian in return received 100,000 ducats from Venice and as much from France. The compact was duly carried out. On February 8th, 1517, wrote the Cardinal of Sion, Verona belonged to the Emperor. On the 9th, to the King Catholic. On the 15th, to the French. On the 17th, to the Venetians. Such was the end of the wars that had arisen from the League of Cambrai. After a struggle of 8 years, the powers that had confederated to destroy Venice came together to restore her to her former place. Venice might well exult in this reward of her long constancy, her sacrifices, and her disasters. The war had drained her resources, but she had no thoughts of yielding, and emerged at last from the conflict safe and sound. Yet Venice was not what she had been before, and no longer threatened Italy, on which the stranger had made good his hold. The military power of Venice never recovered from the defeat of Vaila. It was not so much that Venice had grown smaller, as that the problems of Italian politics had grown larger. It was not her political difficulties, but the altered state of Europe, which prevented her from recovering her old position. Venice was the last great Italian state, and her decay was gradual. But already new roads had been opened for commerce, and she no longer commanded the trade with the East. So far as her courage and resolution were concerned, she could boast that she had withstood the combined powers of Europe, and after a struggle which had lasted for 8 years, had come forth, weakened, it is true, but not shorn of any of her possessions. End of section 27. Section 28 of A History of the Papacy from the Great Schism to the Sack of Rome, Volume 5, by Mandell Creighton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Book 5, Chapter 20, Close of the Lateran Council, 1517, Part 1. During this period of incessant political intrigue, it was not natural that the Lateran Council should make much progress. The three objects which a council was bound to profess, the peace of Christendom, war against the Turk, and the reformation of the Church, could not be pursued separately, for only a general agreement between European powers could supply the force necessary for a crusade or for ecclesiastical reform. The Lateran Council had owed its origin to the political necessities of the Papacy. It was not the Council but the Pope who had done away with an abortive attempt at schism. The Council simply registered the results of the papal diplomacy. Europe as a whole paid little heed to the Council or its proceedings, and amongst the mass of state papers preserved in every country it is scarcely mentioned. Statesmen were not interested in ecclesiastical questions. The general tone of thought was national and practical. The new learning employed the minds of thoughtful men. The spread of commerce attracted the trading classes. Schemes of national aggrandizement filled the minds of statesmen. The Lateran Council would have come to an end had not the Pope still needed it to record a new triumph of papal diplomacy. While this was pending, the council was still kept alive. Though the council consisted only of Italian prelates, those prelates still remained constant to their plan of increasing the importance of their own order. They had succeeded in asserting their ecclesiastical equality with the cardinals, and had struck a blow at the abuse of monastic exemptions from episcopal authority. They went on to make another demand, which aimed at the permanent organization of the episcopal order at the Roman court. They asked for permission to set up an episcopal college or confraternity, which should hold a recognized position at Rome, and should have power to communicate immediately with the Pope and lay before him such questions as from time to time interested the bishops as a class. At first the Pope assented to this proposal, but the cardinals raised the strongest opposition. They were the standing council of the Pope, and in that capacity took charge of all business which it was necessary to lay before him. They acted as protectors of national interests, and were recognized and paid accordingly by kings. The bishops might quote for their proposal the precedent of monastic or other organizations, but these were scarcely parallel cases. A confraternity of prelates, with an organization of its own and the assured right of access to the Pope, would practically have superseded the College of Cardinals, and would have proved a serious limitation to the papal primacy. It would have wrought an entire revolution in the system of the Church. The prelates who made this proposal were most probably ignorant of its real importance, and looked only to their present grievances. They resented the overgrown power of the cardinals. They wished to reduce the monks to obedience, and to re-establish their own jurisdiction. They suffered from such constant encroachments that they saw no way of protecting themselves save that of setting up a chamber of their own with special delegates who should permanently represent their interests in the Roman court. Had the bishops throughout Europe bound themselves together in favour of this scheme, it might have been carried. But the movement was very partial, and was confined to a few Italian bishops who were present in Rome. In fact, it was little more than a struggle of one party in the Curia against another. So unimportant did the matter seem at first that the Pope was inclined to accept it. Consideration and counsel showed him its dangers, and he withdrew his approval. The more he was pressed, the more stubborn he became. At last he told the unfortunate bishops that if they did not withdraw their request, he would hold no further sessions of the council, but would prorogue from year to year. Their demands for the reduction of the privileges of the monastic orders had not yet been embodied as a decree. If they persisted, they would lose what had been already promised. They made a last effort to obtain something in the direction of their wishes, and asked that the prelates present from time to time in the curia should have the power of assembling separately and discussing affairs concerning their order, that they should be allowed to appoint deputies and present petitions to the Pope. They added that to make this scheme useful, it was necessary that the prelates in Rome should not be solely Italians, but chosen from different nations, and that they should have leisure allowed them for this special service. Though this proposal would have made the new council of the Pope dependent mainly on his own selection, it still seemed dangerous and was not allowed. The prelates were indignant that the cardinals had prevailed against them, and were the more determined to urge their victory over the monastic orders. The cardinals tried to modify their demands, but the prelates were firm, and the Pope, who wished to hold a session of the council, was driven to let them have their way. When all these difficulties had been overcome, the 11th session of the council was at last held on December 19th, 1516, in the presence of 16 cardinals and some 70 prelates. The first decree bears traces of an uneasy consciousness that the Church was declining in general esteem, and that the teaching of its ordinary ministers was not in sympathy with the great currents of thought. The growth of the new learning had not intellectually affected the bulk of the clergy. They did not understand it sufficiently either to appreciate its good points or to warn men against its dangerous tendencies. They felt that many subjects of their teaching were openly or tacitly challenged, and instead of meeting the challenge, they fell back upon general denunciations or the testimonies of miraculous stories. The council rebuked these ignorant preachers, warned them against employing threats of impending judgments, against perversion of texts of Scripture, and against the use of fictitious miracles. For the future, all preachers, secular and regular alike, were to be examined by their superiors and receive from them a license to preach. They were ordered to teach nothing save what was contained in the words of Scripture and the interpretation of those doctors whom the Church had recognized. They were not to foretell the coming of Antichrist or the time of the day of judgment. If anyone believed that he had the spirit of prophecy, he was to submit his prophecies to the judgment of the Pope, or, if the need was urgent, to his ordinary. The council's decree was wise and moderate. The misfortune was that ignorance could not be remedied by decrees. The important work of the session was the registration of a triumph of the papal policy in the abolition of the pragmatic sanction of France. However much in other points the popes since Pius II had differed from one another, they had been unanimous in their endeavours to sweep away the separate legislation wherewith the Gallican Church had withdrawn itself from the papal authority. Paul II, Sixtus IV, Innocent VIII had alike striven to procure the formal abolition of these special privileges. They had all been able to win from the king some appearance of concession, but the Parliament refused to register any decree for the abolition of the pragmatic sanction, which was consequently observed so far as suited the convenience of the crown or the interests of his ecclesiastical favourites. But the quarrel of Julius II and Louis XII led to the full establishment of the pragmatic sanction and the renewal of the consular movement. The schismatic council had failed. France had withdrawn its opposition to the Papacy. The abolition of the pragmatic sanction was the natural termination to the struggle and the pledge of friendship for the future. This was one of the questions discussed by Leo X and Francis I when they met at Bologna, and the French Chancellor Duprat declared himself on the Pope's side. A little consideration showed the Pope and the King how they could best secure their mutual advantage, and the terms of an agreement were left for negotiation. The King agreed to abolish the pragmatic sanction and take in its stead a concordat with the Pope. By this compact, both parties were gainers. The pragmatic sanction rested on the basis of the power of general councils, of an inherent right of self-government in the universal church, which was independent of and superior to the papal monarchy. It had been the aim of the restored papacy to root out these ideas. The pragmatic sanction was the last remnant of the consular movement, and no price was too great to pay for its destruction. Leo X left it for diplomacy to settle what were the best terms which he could make with the French king. If the king would abolish the pragmatic sanction, the Pope would grant him as a favour the most profitable of its privileges. On the other side, Francis I aimed at establishing the supremacy of the royal power in France, and it was worth his while to establish it definitely over the French Church. So long as the Church stood on the pragmatic sanction, it rested upon something independent of the royal power. The pragmatic had received the royal assent, but was valid because it claimed to declare the ancient and inherent rights of the universal Church. Other nations might forego those rights, but the Gallican Church proudly maintained them. Francis I felt as little sympathy with such a position as did Leo X. The Pope wished to root out all that was opposed to the papal supremacy. The king wished to be rid of everything that ran counter to the royal omnipotence. So the claims of the Gallican Church were contemptuously thrown aside, and the Pope and the king began to bargain over the fair division of the spoil. Matters were finally settled, and the Concordat was signed on August 18th, 1516. Francis I agreed to the abolition of the pragmatic sanction and obtained instead conventions, which he asked the Gallican Church to accept as equivalent. Leo X granted to the French king powers over the Gallican Church which it was hard to express in terms of ecclesiastical propriety. The French king was allowed to nominate to all bishoprics and abbeys in his kingdom, though the papal approval was reserved. Reservations were abolished. In presentations to benefices, graduates of the universities were to be appointed to vacancies occurring in 4 months of the year. A check was put to papal provisions. Appeals to Rome were restricted. Excommunications and interdicts were to be formally made known before their observance was required. Amongst these regulations we are surprised by a disciplinary enactment which the existing condition of the Church rendered necessary. Bishops were ordered to proceed against clergy living in open concubinage. They were to be punished by a suspension for 3 months, and if they did not put away their concubine, by deprivation of their benefice. Bishops were enjoined in the most solemn words to accept no composition for conniving at this irregularity. The celibacy of the clergy was in such danger of breaking down that it had to be asserted, however incongruously, and at the same time the laity were also exhorted to greater chastity and order in their lives. The council unanimously passed this decree, and the Pope expressed his satisfaction by the emphasis of his vote. I not only assent, but assent greatly and entirely. The next business of the session was to approve the decree which had been the object of such prolonged struggles, the decree for diminishing monastic privileges. It was enacted that bishops should have full power of visiting parish churches, which were served by monasteries, and should correct abuses in their curates. Prelates and secular priests were to be allowed to celebrate the Mass in monastic churches. Monastic vicars were to be liable to examination by bishops as to their fitness for their office. Friars were not to have the power of absolution from sentences passed by ecclesiastical authorities, and were not to administer the sacraments to those who had been refused them by their parish priests. They were not to give absolution to those who had not paid tithes and other ecclesiastical dues, and were in their preaching to urge this as a duty. Brothers and sisters of the third order who lived in their own houses and were only attached loosely to the friars were to receive the sacraments, excepting that of penance, from their parish priest, and were not to be free from the penalties of an interdict by admission to the church of the friars. Generally, the friars were admonished to pay due respect to the bishops as standing in the place of the apostles. This decree met with some opposition. Many were dissatisfied that it did not go far enough, but when the votes were taken it was declared to be carried. It was understood also that the reform of the mendicant orders was to be taken in hand in their chapters, but little result seems to have followed. The subjection of the friars to the authority of the bishops in matters concerning ecclesiastical order was not thoroughly established, and the exemptions which had been abolished were in some points renewed. Women of the tertiary order living in a college were first exempted from the jurisdiction of ordinaries. Then the exemption was extended to virgins living at home, and afterwards to widows. The friars could not openly resist, but they soon recovered the ground they had lost. The decrees of the Lateran Council do not seem to have produced much tangible result in the relation of the mendicant orders towards the bishops. Now that the pragmatic sanction had been triumphantly abolished, the work of the Lateran Council was done, and it only remained for the Pope to get rid of it decorously. On March 16th, 1517, its last session was held, and Paris de Gracie felt a malicious pleasure in selecting Cardinal Carvajal to say Mass, so that the man who had called the council into being by his attempt at schism should grace its triumphant close. The Pope, with 18 cardinals, 86 prelates, and a few ambassadors, represented the greatest number that had ever been present at the sessions of this ecumenical assembly. Letters were read from Maximilian, Francis I, Charles of Spain, and Henry VIII of England, declaring their zeal for the cause of a crusade. They were ornamental documents, necessary to give colour to the imposition of a tax of a tithe on all clerical revenues for the next 3 years. One little point remained to be settled. A decree was passed forbidding in future the pillaging of the house and goods of the cardinal who was elected or was supposed to be elected pope. The custom was obviously a relic of troublesome times, and might well be abolished, but it seems a ludicrous object for the concern of a general council at so momentous a period in the history of the Church. Then was read the decree for the dissolution of the council. It rehearsed all that had been done for the peace of the Church and of Christendom. Schism had been destroyed. All necessary reforms had been accomplished. The faith had been declared and established. The Pope had good hopes that the peace of Christendom would soon be secured, and that all Europe would unite in war against the Turk. With these cheering thoughts, the Pope bade the bishops return home to their flocks. But this happy confidence was by no means universal. The decree could scarcely be heard amidst the expressions of discontent. Many exclaimed that it was not a time for dissolving the council, but rather for beginning its real business. Others said that it was useless to impose tenths for a crusade of which there was no real hope. The opposition to the dissolution was strong, and the Pope's decree only secured a majority of 2 or 3 votes. End of section 28. Section 29 of A History of the Papacy from the Great Schism to the Sack of Rome, Volume 5, by Mandell Creighton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Book 5, Chapter 20, Close of the Lateran Council, 1517, Part 2. The Council of the Lateran is a convincing testimony of the helplessness of those who wished for reform in the Church. It was summoned in answer to an attempt to use a bygone movement as a political weapon against the secular policy of a pope. No one believed in a council. No one wanted a council. There was no question stirring in the minds of churchmen. There was no special demand for reform. There were no men of mark who had any constructive schemes to propose. There was no real business to be done. The kings of Europe did not trouble to send representatives to the council. The national records of the time scarcely mention its existence. Leo X might smile contentedly and congratulate himself that his lot had fallen in pleasant places. His predecessors had trembled at the name of a council. He had found it tolerably easy to manage with a little tact and a little of the spirit of compromise. It had recorded and emphasized his signal victory over the Gallican Church. He, in turn, had gratified its self-importance by allowing it to pass a few insignificant decrees. It did its work submissively and passed away quietly. Yet the records of the Lateran Council show that there was a strong sense of the need of some reform, and that the reforming party sought a basis for future activity in the restoration of episcopal authority. If the Church was to be brought back to its former vigor, a restoration of the episcopate was necessary above all things, but the protection of the episcopate from the aggressions of the cardinals and from the exemptions of the monastic orders would not restore it to its primitive importance. The appointment of bishops were in the hands of kings or pope, and pope and kings alike sought for diplomatic agents rather than pastors of their flocks. There were earnest men in the Church, but it was hard to see how they were to be set in authority. It was useless to furbish up old machinery unless means were found that it should be worked by men of spiritual force. The objects of the Lateran Council were excellent, and its measures were wise as far as they went, but they were wholly inadequate to remove even the most crying evils which were universally condemned. The restoration of ecclesiastical discipline could not be effected by a few well-intentioned decrees. The reforming party was conscious of many evils, but it had no power behind it which was capable of working amendment. Its efforts awakened little interest, and it had no decided policy. The time was unfavorable for action. There was nothing to be done save to hope for the future. It is the most astonishing instance of the irony of events that the Lateran Council should have been dissolved with promises of peace on the very verge of the greatest outbreak which had ever threatened the organization of the Church. It may be pleasant to be free from demands of reform, but it is assuredly dangerous. The quiet of indifference wears the same aspect as the quiet of content, but it needs only a small impulse to convert indifference into antagonism. The man of foresight would have grieved that Europe paid no heed to the Lateran Council. It boded ill for the future that no one wished to hear the voice of the Church. The time is indeed out of joint which has no heart-searchings, no difficulties for solution, no proposals for amendment, no great ideal to pursue. Europe, in fact, was sorely destitute of great ideals. Its princes were engaged in personal rivalry. Its peoples were separated into conscious antagonism. It was a time of material well-being and eager striving after riches. The increase of knowledge had brought self-complacency, and the pride of superior wisdom separated each man from his fellow. Old objects of common effort had passed away, and none had taken their place. A crusade was chimerical. The reform of the Church was not worth the trouble which it would cost. The wise man had his own opinions, which enabled him to lead his own life. As for the ignorant, it mattered little what they were taught. So men reasoned, while each schemed for himself, and the Lateran Council was left to utter threadbare platitudes and raise worn-out cries, while the world went on its way unheeding. Leo X was quite satisfied that so it should be, for the scheming selfishness of the time was nowhere more clearly embodied than in the Pope. who had been brought up in the statecraft of the Medicean house. Amongst the most important of the council's decrees was that of 1513, which was aimed against philosophic skepticism on the question of the immortality of the soul. Yet while the council was still sitting, the chief of the philosophic teachers of Italy did not hesitate to publish a book which put forward all the arguments against this article of the Christian faith. While Francis I and Leo X were conferring in Bologna, Pietro Pomponazzi of Mantua was lecturing in the city and was busy on his treatise on the immortality of the soul. He was an ardent Aristotelian, a fervent follower of Alexander of Aphrodisias, and was notorious for the freedom of his speculations. His book on the immortality of the soul was published in Bologna on September 24th, 1516. In the preface he represents himself as visiting a Dominican friar who was ill. The Dominican, who was a pupil of his, asked him, "Master, the other day in your lectures you said that the position of St. Thomas of Aquin about the immortality of the soul, though you did not doubt of its truth, yet in no way agreed with the sayings of Aristotle. I should like to know first what is your opinion about this matter, setting miracles and revelations on one side. Secondly, what you consider to be the opinion of Aristotle." Pomponazzi, with God's help, undertook to answer these questions. Following the Aristotelian method, he discusses diverse opinions and exposes the weakness of each. He concludes that the question of the immortality of the soul is a neutral problem, like that of the eternity of the world. For no natural reasons can be brought forward which proves the soul to be immortal, still less which prove it to be mortal. In practice it makes a good deal of difference which opinion is followed, for if the soul is immortal, men ought to despise earthly things and seek after heavenly things. If it is mortal, then they must follow the contrary course. Its immortality depends on revelation from God, but each art ought to follow its own method, and immortality should be proved by the method of faith, which depends on Scripture. Other methods are not to the point. Philosophers may differ, Christians may agree, because they possess an infallible method, but they must not proceed according to the wisdom of this world. It was impossible to mistake the covert sneer which lurked beneath such words. Many were offended, and preachers raised their voices against Pomponazzi's teaching. But it is remarkable that Pomponazzi's treatise contained no reference to the Lateran decree, nor do we find that the decree was of much value to his opponents. Pomponazzi was not abashed by opposition, but continued the controversy with increased irony in a way which leaves no doubt of his meaning. He tells us that he was attacked by the cowled herd of the Dominicans, whose office it is to preach, and who preach that they themselves are omniscient. Brother Ambrose, an Augustinian of Naples, was especially zealous in denouncing Pomponazzi in North Italy. Pomponazzi represents himself as a secluded invalid who rarely heard what was passing and wondered with philosophic calm at the storm that was raised about nothing. When his friends told him of the preaching of Brother Ambrose, he exclaimed with an injured air, "He will not find that in any part of my little treatise I have affirmed that the soul is mortal. I have only said that Aristotle thought so, and that immortality cannot be proved by natural reason, but is to be held by sincere faith." He sent a humble message to the preachers who denounced him, begging that they would show him his error, for nothing can be of greater misfortune to a philosopher than ignorance, especially in such a matter. Instead of doing him this favour, Brother Ambrose continued to preach more violently than before, holding up his head and striking his broad chest and exclaiming, "Look here and see if I need fear that pygmy. for Pomponazzi was a dwarf. Hearing this, the dejected philosopher again sent to implore Brother Ambrose to show him his fault. "What," said Ambrose, "he has taken 10 years to write the book. Will he not give me 4 months to discover its errors?" Quick came Pomponazzi's retort. "When he condemned my book in the pulpit, he either knew my errors or he did not. If he did not, why did he condemn me? If he did, why does he need time to inform me of them? His excellent sermons have proved the immortality of the soul. Why is he so anxious to overthrow its mortality? Both Aristotle and Averroes agree that the proof of the necessity of one of 2 opposites proves the impossibility of the other. Tell him that if he does not come within a month, I will denounce him as a babbling preacher, a windy preacher, a man of no parts." Presently Ambrose came to Bologna, but he came as a newly consecrated bishop. Pomponazzi went to see him and was received with kindness. He was told that Agostino Nifo of Naples had written a large treatise against him, which, when published, would show him his mistakes. "If he has proved me to be in error," said Pomponazzi, "I give thanks first to God, then to Brother Agostino for freeing me from my blindness. If, as I hope, I have proved him to be in error, then I shall have the greater praise, so that however the matter ends, I shall be the gainer." The insolence of philosophic superiority could not be carried further than in this account which Pomponazzi gives of his controversy with the preachers, and he could not have written so if he had not known that he was safe. The Dominicans at Venice had taken strong measures against him. They reported on his book to the Patriarch, a simple and most holy man, Pomponazzi tells us, but entirely ignorant of philosophy and theology. The Patriarch laid the matter before the Doge, who forbade the sale of the book, and the Dominicans wrote to Rome to procure the Pope's condemnation. But Cardinal Bembo was a friend and patron of Pomponazzi. He read the accursed book and gave his opinion that it contained nothing worthy of censure. The master of the palace, before whom the question formally came for decision, laughed and agreed with Bembo's opinion. He added that there were many men whose orthodoxy was undisputed, who held Pomponazzi's opinions. Rome was more tolerant than Venice, and in the papal court Pomponazzi's book was read with a smile. Pomponazzi was told that if he went to Venice, men would burn him or hand him over to the boys in the street to stone and pelt with dirt. He trembled at the thought of this menace, till he consoled himself by the thought of the saying of Socrates, "I would rather be put to death unjustly than justly." However, he stayed in the safety of the papal city of Bologna, where he lived unmolested, and on his death in 1525 was buried at the expense of Cardinal Gonzaga. Those who find in the revolt against the papacy the beginnings of an era of free thought and free inquiry take no account of such cases as those of Pomponazzi. He was allowed to discuss with cynical frankness not merely outlying propositions, but the central ideas on which religious life was founded. He was held to be free from blame because he separated the region of philosophic speculation from the region of Christian belief, and was judged in the papal court with the judicial calmness and impartiality which the modern advocates of religious tolerance might well admire. He laid down a principle which was admitted at the papal court. "I do not firmly adhere to anything which I have said in my book, save in so far as the Apostolic See determines. Whatever, therefore, I may have said, whether it be true or false, whether it be in accordance with the faith or contrary to it, I ought not in any way to be held heretical." Provided that he recognized the right of the Church to decide upon the true contents of Christian doctrine, he was at liberty to speculate freely upon the philosophic questions which those doctrines contained. The position was an abstract one, and was not compatible with much zeal or enthusiasm on either side. But it recognized the difficulty of adjusting individual liberty and general order. The philosopher claimed to arrive at rational conclusions by rational methods. The Church claimed to set forth a divine truth concerning the life of man. Provided that the philosopher recognized the paramount authority of the Church, he was at liberty to show within his own limits what he could discover without the Church's help. The Church, on her side, secure in the possession of truth, could afford to allow that man should follow freely his own intellectual methods. If they led him to conclusions contrary to her teaching, it was only an additional testimony to the weakness of the intellect unaided by revelation. Such a compromise might be attractive to students and men of culture. It was too abstract for ordinary life. It demanded an impossible amount of self-restraint and of indifference to the practical issues of life. The scholar in his study might have his own searchings of heart, but when he stepped forward as a teacher, he was bound to consider the issue of his teaching as a whole. Such lectures as those of Pomponazzi could not fail to have a disintegrating effect upon the basis of religious life. We are not uncharitable in supposing that Pomponazzi had this intention, and deliberately chose to attack Christian doctrine by the weapon of irony. However this may be, the Roman court treated him with leniency, and had no wish to enter into a war against philosophy. Pomponazzi was left to defend his position against attack on the side of orthodoxy, and the controversy was carried on by Agostino Nifo, and later by Contarini. But the Pope refused to interfere. The Roman court was not in favor of repressive measures. It allowed free thought beyond the extremist limits of ecclesiastical prudence. The interest in dogmatic theology was slight. There was no recognition in Italy of the authority of the Church to restrain erroneous opinions, nor did the Church venture to claim it. No doubt Leo X and his cardinals flattered themselves that the Church was more in accordance with the spirit of the age than it had ever been before. They were soon to learn that the real spirit of every age speaks not so much in what can be heard and reckoned with, as in the yearnings of yet inarticulate souls. Pomponazzi wrote also on incantations and on fate. In both these works he criticized current conceptions on theological points, and substituted the Aristotelian view of the uniformity of nature for a world full of miracles, while he asserted man's freedom as against any ideas of predestination, divine providence, or even divine grace. In all his writings, Pomponazzi proceeds as a philosophic critic, believing in religion as the root of virtue, but clearly distinguishing between what admitted of rational proof and what was the subject of faith. He is the first writer who gives complete expression to the modern spirit of criticism, as opposed to the constructive theology of the Middle Ages. His attitude of intellectual abstraction from current problems marks the difference between the Italian and the German spirit. The Italian was content to notice the oppositions to which the new learning gave rise. For himself, a life in accordance with virtue was its own reward, and he was contented to live to himself. The German strove to reconstruct the crumbling structure of his intellectual conceptions, and gain a new system in which man might reconcile his difficulties by a quickened sense of his immediate relationship to God. The Lateran Council had done all that it could do in the region of politics, and it was the region of politics that absorbed the attention of Leo X. The Peace of Noyon had restored peace to Europe, but peace was by no means universally welcome. France was glad to have a breathing space. Charles congratulated himself that he was free from the tutelage of Maximilian and could leave Flanders in safety for the purpose of visiting his Spanish kingdoms, where his presence was sorely needed. On the other hand, England saw herself outwitted in diplomacy, and was jealous of French aggrandisement, while Leo X, who had contrived by a judicious policy of wavering neutrality to promote his own interests in Italy, found himself in a strait. No doubt he ought to rejoice in peace, and work for an expedition against the Turk, whose advance was again a source of serious alarm to Europe. But Henry VIII spoke truly when he said to the Venetian envoy, "You are wise, and of your wisdom can understand that no general expedition against the Turk will ever be undertaken, so long as such treachery prevails amongst the Christian powers that their sole thought is to destroy one another." It is small blame to Leo X if he felt this as keenly as any other statesman, and was anxious to minimize the results of the Treaty of Noyon. The contracting powers, Francis I, Maximilian, and Charles, had agreed to meet at Cambrai to confer on a common policy. However much a crusade against the Turk was put forward as a pretext, both Leo X and Henry VIII were afraid of this conference, and did their utmost to prevent it. "Popes," said the Venetian Justinian, "are always disquieted by meetings of great princes, because the first thing dealt with is the reformation of the Church, that is, of popes and cardinals." He might have added that the reformation of the Church meant in those days the furtherance of political schemes for the partition of Italy. The conference at Cambrai was carried on by ambassadors, and agreed to a division of northern and central Italy into two states dependent on the Empire. One division, including Venice, Florence, and Siena, was to be held by Charles or his brother Ferdinand. The other added Piedmont, Mantua, Verona, and Lucca to the French possession of Milan. The scheme was a revival of the old League of Cambrai, and again aimed at the spoliation of Venice. End of section 29. Section 30 of A History of the Papacy from the Great Schism to the Sack of Rome, Volume 5, by Mandell Creighton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Book 5, Chapter 20, Close of the Lateran Council, 1517, Part 3. This proposal came to nothing. Perhaps it was not seriously intended. Charles was preparing for a journey to Spain. Maximilian was helpless, and only caught at anything which still kept open his claims against Venice. Francis I was secretly listening to Wolsey, who saw in an alliance with France a means of restoring the position which England had lost by the Peace of Noyon. Leo X was left destitute of allies, and soon felt the dangers of his defenceless position. The cessation of war in Italy left a number of soldiers unemployed, and the dispossessed Duke of Urbino seized the opportunity to raise an army for the recovery of his possessions. With a body of Spanish, German, and Gascon mercenaries, he advanced in February 1517 into the territory of Urbino, where Lorenzo de' Medici could offer little resistance. In a few weeks Francesco della Rovere was restored to his old possessions. Leo X saw in this the hostility of France. He begged for help from Francis I, who treated him with cold civility, and ordered the governor of Milan to send the Pope reinforcements. But he did not wish to drive him into the arms of Charles, and therefore entered into a league for mutual defence. Even when supported by French help, the papal army was incapable of ousting Francesco della Rovere, who made the chivalrous proposal of deciding the dispute by a single combat between himself and Lorenzo de' Medici. This offer was naturally refused, and the war dragged on for 8 months, to the discomfort of Rome and the draining of the papal treasury. Men laughed that a dukelet should reduce the Church to such extremities, and Leo X was almost beside himself through vexation. The war went on till the resources of Francesco Maria were exhausted, and the Viceroy of Sicily interposed to prevent the extension of French influence. Leo X undertook to pay the arrears due to Francesco Maria's mercenaries on condition that he withdraw from Urbino, and he was allowed to carry away to Mantua his artillery and the famous library which his uncle Federigo had collected. He went away in September, comforting his people with the hope that he would come back in better days, for Francis I had promised to restore him to Urbino when the Pope died, or when he was at open enmity with the Pope. Francis I did not scruple to mock at the Pope's helplessness and remind him of his dependence on the goodwill of France. The War of Urbino not only drained the papal treasury, but also gave an opening to the expression of the discontent which the grasping policy of the Medici had created on many sides. The secular aspect of the Papacy was reproduced in the College of Cardinals, which mirrored only too accurately the dynastic interests of Europe and especially of Italy. Alexander VI had found it necessary to reduce rebellious cardinals by force. Julius II had suffered from an open revolt. Leo X hoped, by an air of easy good nature, to spread general contentment. But it is hard to satisfy men whose interests are attacked, and Leo X, however cautious and plausible, could not escape making enemies. One of the cardinals who had most keenly favoured the election of Leo X was Alfonso, son of Pandolfo Petrucci, Lord of Siena, who through his father's entreaties had been raised to the cardinalate by Julius II at the age of 20. Pandolfo hoped that by this means he had secured Siena for his eldest son Borghese. Siena, however, was in a chronic state of political disturbance. The Sienese wearied of Borghese's rule, and Leo X secretly helped a party who proposed to substitute for Borghese another member of the Petrucci family, Raffaele, who was governor of the castle of Sant'Angelo. Raffaele Petrucci was an old friend of Leo X, and would rule Siena in the interests of the Medici. So by papal help Borghese was expelled, and Raffaele ruled in his stead. Cardinal Petrucci was indignant at his brother's wrongs, and when he saw the Pope hard pressed by Francesco della Rovere, thought that the time was come for a restoration of Siena. He withdrew from Rome and entered into negotiations with Francesco della Rovere. Apparently his action was notorious, for on March 4th Leo X wrote him a letter of kindly remonstrance, in which he warned him that he should regard any attempt on Siena as a conspiracy against his own person. But the cardinal was moved rather by ill success than by the Pope's admonition to withdraw from Siena and seek reconciliation with Leo X. The Pope agreed to receive him in Rome and give him a safe conduct which was guaranteed to the ambassador of Spain. Cardinal Petrucci returned to Rome on May 19th with a numerous escort of armed men, and went first to the Vatican to pay his reverence to the Pope. He was met by his friend the Genoese Cardinal Sauli, who went with him into the chamber of audience. There the two cardinals were arrested by the captain of the Pope's guard, and were carried away to the castle of Sant'Angelo, where they were kept in solitary confinement. The Pope summoned the remaining cardinals and the foreign ambassadors who were in Rome, that he might explain his reasons for his actions. He assured them that he was not moved by any political motives, but was striking at two heinous criminals. He had proof that the imprisoned cardinals had conspired to kill him by poison. He did not propose to judge his own cause, but would commit the matter to the decision of 3 cardinals, Remolino, Accolti, and Farnese. This news naturally created great surprise in Rome, and men did not know how to judge it. The Spanish ambassador entered his protest against the violation of the safe conduct, which was indeed indefensible. The Pope, however, conceived that the enormity of the offence justified any means for its punishment. He behaved as though he were in great terror. The gates of the Vatican were kept closed, and armed men were posted everywhere. The cardinals, when they heard of the severity of the imprisonment of their colleagues, went in a body to the Pope and asked that, out of respect for their office, the prisoners might be allowed 1 attendant each. The Pope granted this request, but no one else was permitted to visit them. Leo X, in short, behaved as though he were conscious of a serious crisis, but Paris de Gracie, who saw him close at hand, doubted about his seriousness. He tells us that he thought it his duty to cheer his master by bidding him cast away his gnawing care and enjoy himself. Leo X answered with a laugh that he had no other object in view. The nature of the evidence before the Pope was scarcely sufficient to justify his arbitrary proceeding. He told the Venetian envoy that a letter of Cardinal Sauli had been found in the hands of a servant of Cardinal Petrucci. It contained the sentence, "I have not been able to accomplish what I promised." When the servant was examined about the meaning of this suspicious remark, he confessed that there was a plot to poison the Pope. As soon as the cardinals were in prison, further evidence was sought. The secretary of Petrucci confessed under torture that a plot had been made to introduce to the Pope as his physician a certain Battisto da Vercelli, who was to poison him by means of an ointment applied to the Pope as a cure for fistula. The imprisoned cardinals were also urged to confess, and the immediate result of their confessions was the arrest of another cardinal. On May 22, 1517, the Pope was preparing to hold a consistory, when Cardinal Accolti, one of the commissioners for the examination of the accused, came to a long interview. The Pope summoned Cardinals Farnese and Raffaele Riario, and no sooner did Riario appear than the Pope, trembling with rage and excitement, rushed out of the room, leaving Riario in charge of the guard. Again the Pope summoned the foreign ambassadors and told them that Petrucci had confessed everything about the plot to poison him and had inculpated Cardinal Riario as an accomplice. "We were scarcely Pope 4 days," exclaimed Leo X, "before these men began to plot our death." Still, in spite of the Pope's declamation, men doubted about Riario's guilt. They remembered that a Medici had a grudge against the man who had been concerned in the Papacy conspiracy, and they thought that Leo X was using his opportunity to quit old scores. If Riario was conscious of guilt, they said, he was prudent enough to have fled when the first victims were seized. The Pope, however, did not treat Riario with severity. He was not committed to prison, but was detained in a room in the Vatican, and his nephew, the Patriarch of Alexandria, paid the Pope 200,000 ducats to obtain his uncle's release. Riario confessed that Cardinal Petrucci had told him of his plan while he had tried to dissuade him. Petrucci, on the other hand, seems to have asserted that Riario answered, "If you wish me to be with you, promise to elect me Pope." Riario withdrew his confession and was committed to the castle of Sant'Angelo. On his way he was in such an agony of terror that he could not walk and had to be carried. The luxurious cardinals of Leo X's court were not fitted to endure solitude, imprisonment, and the threat of torture. it is hard to construct a credible narrative of their intentions from their confessions. More surprises, however, were in store for the cardinals. On June 8th they assembled in consistory, when the Pope burst out into complaints. He had evidence, he said, that 2 other cardinals whom he had trusted had joined in the conspiracy against him. If they would but come forward and confess, he would pardon them freely. If they refused to confess, he would have them carried to prison and would treat them like the other 3. The cardinals gazed on one another in alarm, and no one moved. The Pope asked them to speak, and each in turn denied. Then the Pope summoned Paris de Gracie, and in his presence said, "Before we carry out our intentions, will you or will you not confess which of you are to blame?" There was still no answer, and Leo X's dramatic stroke was a failure. He could not succeed in his unworthy attempt to induce some unsuspected person to criminate himself. Paris de Gracie withdrew, and the Pope had to bring his game to a decorous end. Summoning the 3 cardinals who were acting as commissioners in this case, he put into their hands the process as drawn up by the lawyers who had examined the prisoners and pointed out the names of the accused. The 3 commissioners returned to their seats and proposed that the Pope should interrogate each cardinal on oath. When the turn came of Cardinal Soderini, he pleaded not guilty, whereupon the commissioners called out to him to change his pleading and throw himself at the Pope's feet. As no other course was open, Soderini fell in tears upon the ground and placed his life and goods at the Pope's mercy. Leo X scarcely seemed to hear him, but exclaimed, "There is another." The commissioners turned to Cardinal Hadrian de Castello and called on him to confess. Hadrian instantly denied the charge, but before the threats of imprisonment admitted that he had heard Petrucci vow the Pope's death, but thought that he was a mere boy indulging in rash talk. The Pope submitted to the other cardinals the punishment due to Soderini and Hadrian, and it was agreed that they should jointly pay a fine of 25,000 ducats and should not leave Rome till it was paid. On these conditions they were free to go to their homes. Before dismissing the cardinals, the Pope bound them by the strictest charge to tell no one what had passed. None the less, adds Paris de Gracie, in 2 hours' time it was all the talk of the town. End of section 30. Section 31 of A History of the Papacy from the Great Schism to the Sack of Rome, Volume 5, by Mandell Creighton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Book 5, Chapter 20. Close of the Lateran Council, 1517, Part 4. This singular scene shows us Leo X at his worst. He was engaged in trading with low cunning on the fears of the cardinals, and his sole object was to make money out of their terrors. It would seem that the 2 prisoners were repeatedly questioned if they had spoken of their plot to anyone. One of them at last mentioned Soderini, the other Hadrian, and the Pope acted on their combined information. The story current in Rome was that Hadrian's guilt was simply this. One day he passed Petrucci, who was talking to the surgeon Battista, whom he pointed out to Hadrian, saying, "This fellow will get the college out of trouble." This sort of talk did not betoken a serious conspiracy. It was the brutal joke of a thoughtless youth, which a man of experience could scarcely be expected to take seriously. However, the Pope had got Soderini and Hadrian into his clutches, and soon tightened his grasp. Instead of 25,000 ducats from them jointly, he demanded that sum from each of them. Overwhelmed by the demand, they fled from Rome. Hadrian made his way through Calabria by sea to Zara, and thence to Venice. Soderini went to Palestrina, where the Pope gave him leave to remain. He did not return to Rome in Leo X's lifetime. Hadrian was degraded from the cardinalate, even from the priesthood, and was stripped of all his goods. He wandered in obscure places and died unknown. It was now understood that the Pope wished to make money out of his prisoners. Cardinal Riario was rich and had many relatives who could pay. So long negotiations were begun on his behalf. Genoa and Francis I interceded for Cardinal Sauli, but Petrucci had no friends. On Whitsunday, before Mass, the Pope told the cardinals that he was full of compassion and forgiveness. He was so overcome by his feelings that he wept as he sat in church, and told Paris de Gracie that he suffered through pity for the criminals. But his tender-heartedness soon passed away, and he suddenly showed himself stern and inexorable. His relatives hungered for the preferments of the prisoners, and represented to the Pope his urgent need of money. So Leo X turned to harshness and ordered the judges to do their worst. On June 20th, 1517, a sitting of the consistory was held, which lasted for 9 hours. So loud were the exclamations at the Pope's proposals that the sounds of the altercation were heard outside. At length the Pope pronounced the sentence of deprivation of all goods, benefices, and the rank of cardinal, and handed over the 3 prisoners to the secular courts. On June 25th, the Pope summoned the foreign ambassadors to listen to evidence in the trial. He was sufficiently thoughtful to warn them to make a good breakfast, as it would take some time. The warning was necessary, for the wearied ambassadors sat for 7 hours and a half, during which they heard nothing that they did not know before. According to the evidence, Cardinal Petrucci confessed his plot to murder the Pope by introducing Giovanni Battista da Vercelli as the Pope's surgeon. He had told his scheme to Sauli and Riario. The Venetian Marco Minio seems to have been convinced by the evidence, though he objected to the way in which the confessions of each of the accused were read to the others, so that the story was put into their mouths. Riario denied all knowledge of the matter till the confessions of the others were read to him. Then he said, "Since they have said so, it must be true." He added that he had spoken about it to Soderini and Hadrian, who laughed, and said they would make him Pope. After this, the inferior criminals, Giovanni Battista and Petrucci's secretary, were put to death with horrible barbarity. They were drawn through the streets, and their flesh was dragged from their bones with red-hot pincers. Then they were gibbeted on the bridge of Sant'Angelo. Petrucci was strangled in his prison. Riario and Sauli were allowed to buy their freedom. Riario agreed to pay the enormous sum of 150,000 ducats, Sauli 50,000. Leo X used his opportunity to good effect. This conspiracy against the life of the Pope and Leo X's behaviour in the matter give us an unfavourable picture of the morals of the Roman court. The conspiracy, however, was not a very serious one, and certainly was not managed with the dexterity of hardened criminals. Petrucci, young and hot-headed, seems to have been beside himself with rage at the political disaster of his house. He used incautious language and indulged in foolish threats. Perhaps the plan of poisoning the Pope was suggested to him by the villainous surgeon Battista, as a means of getting money from a dupe. Leo X does not seem to have believed in the guilt of the other cardinals, though he used his chance of paying off old grudges and gaining money which he sorely needed. He did not scruple to debase the whole college of cardinals by treating them as suspected criminals. But this was the cunning of a man who wished to gain a further end. He was enabled to overbear their opposition to a new creation of cardinals, and he used his chance unmercifully. On July 1st he created 31 cardinals, wishing, says Marco Minio, to outdo Urban VI, who only created 29. The new cardinals were chosen from political reasons and because they were the Pope's creatures. Leo X wished to bind the papacy through the cardinals to the Medicean house. That the Pope was rather pleased with the terror which he inspired, we gather from a story of Paris de Gracie, who on July 24th brought Cardinal Riario into the consistory that he might be formally restored to his dignity. On coming into the Pope's presence, Riario began his speech. "The master of the ceremonies is to blame for not informing me beforehand that I had to speak before your Holiness." Paris, after the speech was ended, whispered to the Pope that he was afraid when Cardinal Riario mentioned his name that he was going to denounce him as privy to the plot. The Pope burst into laughter and said that he had thought the same. It was too good a joke to be lost, and when the ceremony was over, the Pope told it aloud, and all the cardinals went away laughing. They clearly appreciated the practical use of a conspiracy as giving an opportunity for indiscriminate accusations. The proceeds of the conspiracy and of the new creation of cardinals enabled Leo X to bear the expenses of the War of Urbino. When that was ended, he had time to look round upon the affairs of Christendom. Europe was at peace, save for the differences between Maximilian and Venice, and the desire of France to recover Tournai from the English. The progress of the Turkish arms was the great danger of the future, for a warlike sultan sat on the Turkish throne. Selim overran Syria and Egypt, and was building a fleet which menaced the Mediterranean coast. The time was certainly ripe for a European undertaking against the enemy of its civilization, and Leo X drew up a project for a crusade. A truce was to be proclaimed throughout Europe, and the Pope was to be arbiter of all disputes. The Emperor and the King of France were to lead the army. England, Spain, and Portugal were to furnish a fleet. The combined forces were to be directed against Constantinople. The Pope sent this project to the princes of Europe. Francis I was quite willing to accept it, for he had the Pope sufficiently under his control to reap all the advantages of submitting European affairs to papal arbitration. For the purpose of drawing the Pope more entirely to his side, he proposed a marriage for his nephew Lorenzo de' Medici. He offered him Madeleine de la Tour, daughter of a sister of Francis of Bourbon, Count of Vendôme, and so connected with the royal house. In return, he demanded the proceeds of the tithe to be raised for the crusade during the next 3 years. He would borrow it till it was actually needed. The Pope agreed, and the marriage of Lorenzo was solemnized in April 1518. The Pope's presents to the bride were magnificent. Amongst them was a bed made of tortoiseshell inlaid with pearl. 36 horses were required to carry these presents to Paris, and their cost was estimated at 300,000 ducats. It was clear that the Pope's ardour for a crusade did not involve any self-denial to himself or his relatives. The marriage of Lorenzo produced no lasting results. Madeleine died in childbirth within a year, and Lorenzo followed her to the grave on April 29th, 1519. Their infant daughter, Catherine, was destined to carry into French history the matured experience of Medici and statecraft. Though Francis I might favour the Pope's project of a crusade, Maximilian's inventiveness prompted him to draft a scheme of his own, by which the invasion of the Turkish territory was to be conducted on a graduated plan extending over 3 years. Perhaps no one heeded Maximilian, but England also showed little ardour for the Pope's plan. "If the Pope is in earnest," wrote Wolsey to his agent in Rome, "let him curb the ambition of those who make the peace of Europe impossible. Let him exhort the French king to moderate his cupidity, or the crusade will never be achieved." So wrote Wolsey at the time that he was carrying on negotiations with France. He wished for the peace of Europe, but that peace was to be the work of England, and was to rest on England's guarantee. He had no confidence in the results of papal arbitration. The negotiations between England and France were carried on with profound secrecy, that they might not awaken the alarm of Charles of Spain, who did not wish the frontier town of Tournai to fall again into the hands of France. So Wolsey worked by himself, and when in March 1518 Leo X appointed legates to visit the courts of Europe about the question of a crusade, England pleaded its rule against the admissions of legates a latere. The legate chosen for England was one of the new cardinals, Lorenzo Campeggio, a Bolognese, who had done good service as a diplomatist in Germany. Campeggio was not allowed to visit England till Wolsey had been joined to him in the legateship, and when he came in July, he was only useful to give greater splendour to Wolsey's triumph. Wolsey had cautiously advanced with his negotiations, and the birth of a son to Francis I in February 1518 gave him the means of proposing a closer friendship between England and France. On July 9th, 2 articles were signed for the restoration of Tournai and the marriage of the Dauphin to Henry VIII's daughter Mary, an infant of 2 years old. In September, a splendid embassy from France visited England, and the ceremonies of betrothal between the royal children were performed. The peace between England and France was, by Wolsey's cleverness, turned into a universal peace under the guarantee of England and France. The great powers, the Pope, the Emperor, France, Spain, and England, were to ratify it within 4 months. The smaller states within 8 months. This treaty was signed at London on October 3rd by France and England. It meant that Francis I, to gain the alliance of England, was obliged to sacrifice the advantages which he might gain from setting up the Pope as arbiter in Europe. It meant that Wolsey had developed his design of using the national advantages of England in such a way as to make her the mediator of European politics. It marked another advance in the national organization of Europe, another step in the decay of the international position of the Papacy. Leo X had laboured for a universal peace of which he was to be the guardian. Wolsey had worked out a counterplan by which peace rested on the mediation of England. Leo X had no other course open to him than to ratify the Treaty of London. He did so in a half-hearted way, reserving all his existing obligations and all the rights of the Holy See. Now that peace was made, there remained the crusade against the Turk. But this cry had long lost all reality, and was merely a decent cloak for diplomacy and a means of raising money. Statesmen knew only too well that a question would soon have to be decided which would determine the future relations of Europe. The Emperor Maximilian was in failing health, and the succession to the empire, however decided, would be of momentous importance. The intentions of the German electors were the objects of keener interest than the successes of the Turk. The efforts of the papal collectors to raise money for a crusade caused murmurings on every side. Men knew that popes and kings liked to talk about crusades, because it suited them to impose new taxes on the people and arrange between themselves for a division of the spoil. Men murmured, but popes and kings paid little heed to their murmurings. It chanced, however, that an Augustinian monk at Wittenberg raised a protest which grew into unexpected importance and developed into a religious movement which shook the papacy to its basis. With the rise of the Lutheran movement, the perspective of the history of the papacy is entirely changed. Though Leo X did not know it, his secular policy ceased from that time to be of any interest. Thenceforth, the Pope was not to be judged by his capacity to maintain himself in his Italian territories, but he was called to account as the head of the Christian Church. The historical dignity which is wanting to the papacy in the period which we have traversed is restored in the period which now begins. At the time when its security seemed greatest, when it had its roots most firmly in material interests, when it was most in accordance with the spirit of the age, it was suddenly called upon to justify its immemorial position. End of section 31. Read by Pamela Nagami, M.D. in Encino, California, October 2025. End of A History of the Papacy from the Great Schism to the Sack of Rome, Volume 5, by Mandell Creighton.